Good evening. Tonight, we're tracing the complete history of the hamburger, from the steppes of Central Asia, where nomadic peoples first learned to preserve meat by grinding and shaping it, to the global fast food empires of the 21st century. It's a story that spans 2,000 years, crosses 5 continents, and reveals how a simple sandwich became the world's most recognized meal. This is how ground meat transformed from a practical necessity for horseback warriors into a symbol of American culture that reshaped global eating habits. If you enjoy these deep dives into history, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, late at night or early morning, for these journeys into the past. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's go in. The story begins not in an American diner or a medieval German port, but on the vast grasslands of Central Asia, sometime around the year 1000 CE. Here, among the Mongol and Turkic peoples who lived their entire lives on horseback, a practical problem demanded an elegant solution. These were societies in constant motion, herding animals across thousands of miles, raiding settlements, establishing trade routes that would eventually connect east and west. They needed food that could travel with them, food that required no cooking fire that might give away their position, food that could be prepared while moving. The solution these nomadic warriors developed was as brutal as it was ingenious. They would take tough cuts of meat, often horse, sometimes lamb or beef, and place them under their saddles. As they rode, the constant pressure and friction of their weight, combined with the warmth of the horse's body and the salt from the animal's sweat, would begin to break down the meat's fibers. By evening, what had started as a tough, nearly inedible piece of flesh had been transformed into something tender enough to eat raw or with minimal cooking. The mechanical tenderization had effectively begun the process of breaking down the meat structure, making it digestible and, crucially, more compact. But tenderizing alone wasn't enough. These riders discovered that chopping or grinding the meat after this process made it even more practical. Ground meat could be shaped into flat patties that dried more quickly, stored more efficiently, and could be eaten without utensils, a significant advantage for people who spent their days gripping reins and weapons. The practice spread among the Mongol hordes, the Tatars, and various Turkic groups, each adding their own refinements. Some mixed in wild onions found on the steppes. Others added salt when they could get it. The goal was always the same: portable, durable protein that required minimal preparation. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans had been grinding and mincing meat for far longer than the Mongol innovations of the medieval period. Excavations at sites throughout the ancient world have revealed grinding stones with residues that indicate meat processing. In what is now Turkey, sites dating back to 8000 BCE show evidence of systematic meat preparation that included pounding and grinding. The reasons were fundamentally practical. Early humans, lacking the specialized teeth of carnivores, needed ways to make meat more digestible. Grinding accomplished this. It also allowed cooks to make use of every scrap of an animal, the tougher cuts, the odd pieces that couldn't be roasted or boiled whole. By the time of the ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean and Near East, ground meat had become a staple preparation technique. The ancient Egyptians, according to hieroglyphic records and archaeological findings, prepared minced meat dishes, often mixing the meat with breadcrumbs and local spices. These weren't eaten as sandwiches. The concept wouldn't emerge for centuries, but as formed patties or balls, usually cooked in oil or animal fat. The practice served multiple purposes. It made expensive meat go further by mixing it with cheaper grains. It allowed for the even distribution of precious spices and seasonings, and it created a more tender final product than whole muscle cuts often provided. The ancient Romans elevated ground meat preparation to something approaching an art form. In the cookbook attributed to Apicius, a collection of Roman recipes compiled around the 4th or 5th century CE, several dishes call for ground or finely minced meat. One recipe, Isitia aumentata, describes patties made from minced meat mixed with wine-soaked bread, pepper, and pine nuts, wrapped in cool fat and cooked. Another preparation involved ground meat mixed with grain, forming an early ancestor to modern meatballs. The Romans understood that grinding meat wasn't just about tenderization. It was about creating new textures and allowing flavors to meld in ways that whole cuts couldn't achieve. What made these preparations necessary wasn't just culinary ambition. The ancient world lacked refrigeration, and meat spoiled quickly, especially in the warm Mediterranean climate. Grinding meat and mixing it with salt, spices, and wine served a preservative function. The increased surface area meant that preservation ingredients could penetrate more thoroughly. Salt, the most precious preservative, could be distributed evenly throughout. The addition of wine, with its acidic and alcoholic properties, further inhibited bacterial growth. Ground meat preparations weren't just delicious. They were one of the few ways to make meat last more than a day or two. The binding techniques developed in these ancient cultures reveal a sophisticated understanding of food chemistry, even if the underlying science wasn't understood. Cooks discovered that mixing ground meat with bread soaked in water or wine created a texture that held together better during cooking. The starches in the bread absorbed moisture and helped bind the protein molecules. Eggs, when available, served a similar function. The proteins in egg whites and yolks created a matrix that kept the meat mixture cohesive. These techniques would be passed down through centuries, eventually becoming standard practice in European cooking. Different ancient cultures approached ground meat with their own variations, shaped by available ingredients and cooking methods. In ancient Persia, what is now Iran, cooks developed early versions of dishes that would later be called kebabs, ground meat mixed with onions and spices, shaped around skewers. The ancient Hebrews had dietary laws that influenced their meat preparations, including detailed instructions about which animals could be eaten and how they should be butchered. Ground meat offered a way to use kosher animals efficiently, incorporating every permissible part. In China, by the time of the Han Dynasty, roughly 200 BCE to 200 CE, cooks were preparing minced meat dishes that bore similarities to Western preparations, though they arrived at them independently. Chinese cooks mixed ground pork with ginger, garlic, and soy-based seasonings, creating dumplings and other dishes. The grinding wasn't done under saddles, but with cleavers, the broad, heavy Chinese chef's knife that could be rocked back and forth to mince meat finely. The technique was different, but the fundamental insight was the same. Ground meat offered versatility and efficiency. The spread of ground meat preparations followed trade routes and conquering armies. When Alexander the Great's forces moved through Central Asia in the 4th century BCE, they encountered nomadic peoples with their own meat preparation traditions. When the Roman Empire expanded northward into Germanic territories and westward into what is now France and Britain, Roman culinary practices, including ground meat dishes, came with the legions. Knowledge moved along the Silk Road, that vast network of trade routes connecting east and west. A merchant who tasted a meat preparation in one city might describe it to cooks in another, thousands of miles away. But perhaps the most important legacy of these ancient ground meat traditions was the fundamental understanding they established, that meat didn't have to be cooked and eaten as whole cuts. It could be transformed, mixed, shaped, and reformed into something new. This conceptual breakthrough, that food could be broken down and reconstituted, would prove essential to the eventual development of the hamburger. The Roman patty wrapped in caul fat, the Mongol warrior's saddle-tenderized meat, the Persian kebab. These were all expressions of the same insight, adapted to different cultures and circumstances. By the end of the ancient period, as the Roman Empire fragmented and the early Middle Ages began, ground meat preparation had become an established technique throughout much of Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The specific recipes varied, the names changed, the spices differed based on what grew locally. But the core practice had spread far beyond its origins. In the medieval period that followed, these traditions would continue to evolve, moving northward into the colder climates of Northern Europe, where they would encounter new needs and develop new forms. The port cities of the Baltic Sea, particularly Hamburg, would become the next crucial setting in this story, a place where ancient traditions of ground meat preparation would collide with new patterns of trade and migration. As the medieval period unfolded across Europe, the ancient techniques of ground meat preparation began their slow migration westward and northward, carried by merchants, soldiers, and the countless unnamed travelers who moved along the trade routes connecting east to west. What had been practical necessity on the Central Asian steppes was about to encounter the very different needs and conditions of medieval European society, a world of walled cities, feudal estates, Christian dietary restrictions, and an emerging network of commerce that would reshape how people ate. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, created unprecedented movement between Europe and the Middle East. European knights and soldiers returning from the Holy Land brought back more than religious fervor and war stories. They brought tastes, techniques, and a hunger for the spices they'd encountered in the Levant. Ground meat preparations, which had long been common in the Islamic world and Byzantine Empire, began appearing in the kitchens of European nobles. These early medieval recipes were often heavily spiced, not just for flavor, but because strong seasonings masked the taste of meat that was beginning to turn. Without refrigeration, even ground meat mixed with preservatives lasted only a few days at best. By the 12th and 13th centuries, medieval European cookbooks, written primarily for wealthy households, began including what were called force meats. The term came from the French farcir, meaning to stuff, and these preparations involved finely ground or pounded meat mixed with bread, eggs, and whatever spices the household could afford. Pepper, cinnamon, and ginger featured prominently for those who could get them. For common people, local herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme had to suffice. These forcemeats served multiple purposes. They could be used to stuff other foods, chickens, pies, vegetables. They could be shaped into balls and poached in broth. They could be formed into patties and fried in lard. The medieval meatball emerged as a distinct form across much of Europe, with each region developing its own variation. In Italy, polpette combined ground meat with cheese and herbs. In the Iberian Peninsula, under the influence of Moorish cuisine, albondigas incorporated Arabic spice combinations. In Scandinavia, where the medieval period saw increasing trade contact with the rest of Europe, cooks developed early versions of köttbullar, meatballs, that would later become iconic Swedish fare. The common thread was efficiency. Ground meat allowed cooks to stretch precious protein by mixing it with bread, grain, or vegetables, feeding more people from a single animal. Sausage making, an even older preservation technique, flourished during the medieval period. Unlike simple ground meat patties, sausages involved stuffing ground, seasoned meat into animal intestines, creating a casing that provided additional protection from spoilage. Every region developed its own traditions. German territories became particularly renowned for their sausages, bratwurst, bockwurst, weisswurst, each with specific spice blends and preparation methods dictated by local guild regulations. The guilds, those powerful medieval trade organizations, enforced strict standards about what could go into sausages, how they should be prepared, and who could make them. These regulations would later influence how German butchers approached all ground meat preparations. It was in the German-speaking regions of medieval Europe that some of the most direct ancestors of the modern hamburger began to take shape. By the 14th and 15th centuries, German cooks had developed what they called Met, raw minced pork or beef, heavily seasoned with salt, pepper, and onions. Met was eaten fresh, usually on bread, and its safety depended entirely on the quality of the meat and the speed with which it was consumed. Only in the coldest months could Met be kept for more than a few hours. Butchers who sold bad Met could be severely punished by the guilds, sometimes even expelled from their trade. Frikadellen emerged as a cooked alternative. Patties of ground meat mixed with bread soaked in water or milk, onions, and eggs, then pan-fried until browned. The name itself had French origins, from fricando, suggesting the cross-pollination of culinary ideas across medieval Europe. But the German preparation became distinct, typically flatter and broader than French meatballs, more heavily peppered, and often served without sauce. These were working-class food, affordable protein that could be sold by street vendors or prepared at home with minimal expense. A family could make a pound of meat, feed 6 people, by mixing it with bread and onions. Hamburg itself, which would eventually lend its name to the dish we know today, was rising to prominence during this medieval period. Founded in the 9th century, Hamburg became a crucial member of the Hanseatic League by the 13th century, that powerful association of merchant guilds that dominated Baltic sea trade from the 13th through 17th centuries. The city's position at the confluence of the Elbe and Ulster rivers made it an ideal trading port. Ships arriving from Scandinavia, Russia, and the eastern Baltic brought grain, timber, and furs. Ships departing carried manufactured goods, beer, and salt, the medieval world's most essential preservative. Hamburg's wealth came partly from its role in the meat trade. Cattle from throughout northern Europe were driven to Hamburg for slaughter and processing. The city's butchers developed reputations for quality, and their guild regulations were particularly strict. By the 15th century, Hamburg had become known for a particular style of beef preparation. The exact details are lost to history. Medieval butchers didn't write down their recipes. They demonstrated them to apprentices. But evidence suggests Hamburg butchers were preparing chopped or ground beef, seasoned simply with salt and pepper, formed into thick patties, and pan-fried in butter or lard. This Hamburg-style beef became associated with the city's port workers and sailors, substantial food for men doing hard physical labor. The Hanseatic trade network meant that Hamburg-style beef traveled wherever Hamburg merchants did. In the ports of the Baltic Sea, Lübeck, Gdansk, Riga, Stockholm, local cooks encountered these preparations and adapted them. The technique was straightforward enough that it required no special equipment or rare ingredients, just decent beef and basic seasonings. What distinguished the Hamburg style, according to later accounts, was its simplicity and the quality of the beef itself. Where other regional variations added bread, eggs, or elaborate spice blends, Hamburg butchers prided themselves on letting the meat's flavor dominate. Meanwhile, far to the east, a different tradition of ground meat preparation was developing in the Russian Empire and surrounding territories. What would eventually be called steak tartare, raw ground beef, highly seasoned, often mixed with raw egg and onions, had origins in the same Central Asian nomadic traditions that had spread westward centuries earlier. The Tatars, who had conquered much of Russia in the 13th century under the Mongol Empire, brought their meat preparation techniques with them. Even after the Mongol withdrawal, these culinary practices remained, adapted by Russian and Eastern European cooks into their own traditions. The Russian preparation differed from the German in crucial ways. Where German cooks generally cooked their ground meat, at least outside of the raw met tradition, Russian and Polish cooks embraced raw preparations. The meat was scraped or minced very finely, seasoned aggressively with salt, pepper, and raw onion, and eaten immediately. This required absolute freshness and quality. There was no margin for error when consuming raw meat. The dish became associated with aristocratic tables, where the wealth to afford premium beef and the household staff to prepare it properly were available. By the 16th century, this preparation was spreading westward into Poland, Lithuania, and eventually to Western Europe, where French chefs would later rename it steak tartare as a nod to its Tatar origins. Preservation remained the central challenge for all ground meat preparations throughout the medieval and early modern period. Grinding meat increased its surface area dramatically, which meant it spoiled much faster than whole cuts. Medieval and early modern cooks developed several strategies to extend ground meat's viability. Salt was the most common preservative, though it was expensive enough that only wealthier households could use it liberally. Smoke curing worked for sausages, but was impractical for loose ground meat. Cooking killed bacteria and extended shelf life, but cooked meat still spoiled within a few days. The spice trade, which intensified during the 15th and 16th centuries, offered another preservation avenue. Black pepper, beyond its flavor, had mild antimicrobial properties. Cloves, cinnamon, and other spices that became more available as European powers established direct trade routes to Asia could mask spoilage and potentially slow bacterial growth. The heavily spiced meatballs and forcemeats of medieval European cuisine weren't just about taste, they were about safety and preservation. Cold storage provided the only reliable preservation before the modern era. In northern climates, winter allowed for weeks or even months of safe meat storage. Root cellars, caves, and ice houses cut into hillsides could maintain temperatures just above freezing. Some wealthy estates maintained ice through summer by insulating winter ice in underground chambers packed with sawdust. But these were luxuries. For most people, meat preservation meant salting, drying, smoking, or simply eating it very quickly. By the end of the 16th century, ground meat preparations had become firmly established across European cuisine, with distinct regional traditions reflecting local tastes, available ingredients, and cultural preferences. The Italian polpetta wasn't the same as the German frikadelle, which wasn't the same as the Swedish köttbullar or the Spanish albondiga, but they all descended from the same fundamental insight that ground meat offered versatility and efficiency that whole cuts couldn't match. Each culture had adapted the technique to its own needs, creating the culinary diversity that European immigrants would later carry to the New World. The city of Hamburg stood out in this landscape not because its preparations were necessarily superior, but because its position in international trade made its name known far beyond its walls. Hamburg style became a recognizable term in ports throughout Northern Europe. When Germans began emigrating to the Americas in the 19th century, they would bring these traditions with them, along with Hamburg's reputation for quality beef. The city's name, attached to a style of ground beef preparation, was about to begin a journey that would eventually take it around the world. Hamburg entered the 17th century as one of Northern Europe's most prosperous cities, its wealth built on the twin foundations of maritime trade and meat processing. The city's population had swelled to nearly 40,000 by 1600, making it one of the largest urban centers in the German-speaking world. Its harbor teemed with activity. Ships from Amsterdam, London, Copenhagen, and dozens of Baltic ports unloaded goods along the wharves, while Hamburg's own merchant fleet carried German manufactures throughout the known world. But beneath this mercantile prosperity, in the taverns and cookhouses near the docks, a humbler food tradition was solidifying its identity. The working men of Hamburg's port, stevedores, sailors, shipbuilders, warehouse workers, needed food that was cheap, filling, and quick to prepare. These weren't men who could afford roasts or fine cuts of meat. They couldn't wait hours for a stew to simmer. They needed protein they could eat standing up, between shifts, food that cost a few pfennigs and could be consumed in minutes before returning to 12 or 14 hours of brutal physical labor. Hamburg's butchers, responding to this market, had perfected a solution. Thick patties of ground beef, seasoned simply with salt and pepper, fried quickly in rendered fat until browned on both sides, but still juicy within. This preparation, which locals simply called Rundstück warm, literally warm bread roll, referring to how it was often served, became increasingly associated with Hamburg itself. By the 18th century, ship's captains provisioning for voyages would stock up on what they now called Hamburg-style beef. The preparation traveled well for the first day or two of a voyage if kept cool, and the patties could be reheated easily or even eaten cold. More importantly, the dish carried Hamburg's reputation for quality. The city's butchers had spent centuries building trust through their guild's rigorous standard. The Hamburg Butchers Guild, the Knochenhauer Amt, exercised extraordinary control over meat processing in the city. Established formally in 1375, though with roots stretching back further, the guild regulated every aspect of the trade. A master butcher in Hamburg had typically served a 3-year apprenticeship, followed by several years as a journeyman, before even being eligible to apply for master status. The guild inspected shops regularly, enforced price controls to prevent gouging, and maintained strict rules about which cuts could be sold as what grade. Any butcher caught selling diseased meat, mixing inferior cuts into premium products, or falsifying weights faced heavy fines or expulsion from the guild, which meant expulsion from the trade entirely. This regulatory framework meant that when a Hamburg butcher sold ground beef, customers could trust its quality. The guild prohibited mixing different animals in ground preparations. Beef was beef, pork was pork, and never the two should meet. They required that ground meat be prepared fresh each day, never carried over from previous days' stock. These standards weren't altruistic. The guild understood that Hamburg's reputation depended on consistent quality, and that reputation translated directly into commercial advantage. A ship's captain who'd eaten good beef in Hamburg would return to Hamburg and would recommend Hamburg to other captains. The preparation method itself was deceptively simple, but it required skill to execute properly. A Hamburg butcher would typically use chuck or round, tougher cuts from the shoulder or leg that were affordable but flavorful. The meat would be ground coarse, not into a paste, but leaving distinct small pieces visible. This coarse grind was crucial, too fine, and the patty became dense and tough when cooked. The right texture allowed the meat to remain tender while still holding together. Salt and black pepper were mixed into the meat, the only seasonings in traditional Hamburg preparation. Some butchers added a small amount of finely minced onion, but purists considered this an adulteration. The meat was formed into patties roughly an inch thick and 4 or 5 inches across, compressed firmly enough to hold together, but not so tightly that they became compacted. A well-made Hamburg patty had a slight looseness to its texture. The cooking happened in a heavy iron pan over high heat, using either butter or beef tallow. The fat had to be hot enough that the meat seared immediately on contact, creating the browned crust that sealed in juices. 2 or 3 minutes per side produced a patty browned outside but still pink within. Important both for flavor and for the practical reason that working men's stomachs could better handle meat that wasn't cooked to dryness. The economic logic of ground beef was inescapable for working-class families. A pound of premium steak might cost 30 pfennigs in 18th century Hamburg, half a day's wages for a dock worker. But the tougher cuts, suitable for grinding, cost 8 or 10 pfennigs per pound, and a quarter-pound patty, bulked slightly with a handful of breadcrumbs if necessary, could feed a grown man adequately. For a family of 5, ground beef meant the difference between eating meat twice a week or going weeks between proper protein. The dish wasn't aspirational or elegant. It was fuel, an affordable fuel at that. By the late 18th century, Hamburg's preparation had spread to other German port cities. In Bremen, 60 miles to the west, butchers prepared similar patties, though Bremen added more onion and sometimes a splash of beer to the meat mixture. In Lübeck, the other great Hanseatic port on the Baltic coast, the preparation remained closer to Hamburg's austere style. In Kiel, Denmark's border proximity meant Danish influences crept in. A touch of allspice, a binding of egg. But all of these cities acknowledged Hamburg as the origin point. Hamburg style had become a recognizable term throughout northern Germany, a shorthand for a particular approach to ground beef. German culinary culture, more broadly, had always held beef in particular esteem, distinct from the pork that dominated much German cookery. This cultural preference had roots in both economics and tradition. Cattle were larger investments than pigs, and beef was correspondingly more expensive and associated with substance and prosperity. A family that could afford beef regularly was doing well. The great roasts served at festival times, the elaborate beef stews of the winter months, the smoked beef specialties of various regions, all signaled a certain status. Ground beef occupied an interesting position in this hierarchy. It was beef, yes, but affordable beef, democratized beef, stripped of pretension. The preparation methods varied more widely in inland German regions, where Hamburg's direct influence was weaker. In Bavaria, cooks mixed ground beef with pork and added marjoram and lemon zest, a much more ornate approach than Hamburg's simplicity. In the Rhineland, ground meat was often combined with potatoes and formed into large patties called frikadellen, a term that had evolved from the medieval fricandeau, but now referred to something quite specific, a hand-sized patty, thicker than Hamburg style, that might contain as much bread and onion as meat. In Saxony, ground beef was frequently made into a dish called Hackpeter, eaten raw on bread with onions, closer to the Russian Tartar traditions than to the cooked Hamburg preparation. What distinguished Hamburg wasn't innovation, but consistency and reputation. The same basic patty, prepared the same way, available from dozens of butchers and cookhouses throughout the city, every day, year after year, for generations. This consistency meant that Hamburg's name became attached to the preparation itself. By the early 19th century, restaurant menus in German cities were beginning to list Hamburger Rindsteak, or simply Hamburger steak, a recognition that Hamburg had become synonymous with a particular style of ground beef preparation. The early 19th century brought significant changes to Hamburg's economy and society. The Napoleonic Wars and the continental system briefly disrupted Hamburg's trade between 1806 and 1814, but the city recovered quickly. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 confirmed Hamburg's status as a free city within the German Confederation, giving it unusual autonomy and favorable trading rights. The city's population began growing rapidly, doubling between 1800 and 1850. The port expanded, new warehouses rose along the Elbe, and Hamburg solidified its position as Germany's gateway to the wider world. This growth meant increasing demand for affordable food. The working population swelled with rural Germans migrating to the city for jobs in shipping, manufacturing, and trade. These newcomers brought their own regional food traditions, but quickly adopted Hamburg's signature preparations. The Hamburger steak became even more firmly associated with the working class experience. Quick, cheap, available on nearly every street corner near the port. Cookhouses that had once served primarily sailors now fed factory workers, construction laborers, and the growing ranks of the urban poor. The German butchers guilds faced new pressures during this period of industrialization and urbanization. The traditional guild system, which had controlled meat processing for centuries, was gradually being undermined by new economic forces. Calls for free trade and deregulation grew louder. Some reformers argued the guilds were monopolistic obstacles to progress. The guilds responded by emphasizing quality control and tradition, arguments that resonated with consumers who worried about what might happen to food safety if guild oversight disappeared. The Hamburg Butchers Guild, in particular, promoted its reputation aggressively, understanding that quality standards were its competitive advantage in a changing world. By mid-century, Germany was experiencing social and economic transformation that would eventually drive millions to emigrate. The failed revolutions of 1848 left many Germans disillusioned with prospects for political reform. Agricultural changes and population growth made it increasingly difficult for small farmers to survive. The lure of opportunity in the Americas grew stronger with each ship that departed Hamburg's harbor, and Hamburg itself was perfectly positioned to facilitate this emigration. It had the ships, the connections to transatlantic routes, and the infrastructure to provision voyages to America. The Hamburg-style beef preparation was about to embark on its own journey. German emigrants leaving through Hamburg's port in the 1840s and 1850s carried memories of the taste with them, memories of that browned crust, the peppery bite, the satisfaction of affordable protein eaten hastily before a day's labor. These weren't aristocrats leaving Germany. These were working people, people who'd eaten ground beef patties regularly because that's what they could afford. When they arrived in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cincinnati, or Milwaukee, they would look for familiar food, and enterprising German immigrant butchers and restaurant owners would be ready to provide it. Hamburg had given its name to a preparation that was about to cross an ocean and undergo a transformation that would eventually make it the world's most recognized food. But in the 1850s, as German emigrants packed onto ships in Hamburg's harbor, none of them could have imagined that the simple beef patty they were leaving behind would return to Europe a century later as an American phenomenon, barely recognizable as the dish that had once fueled Hamburg's dock workers through their long shifts along the Elbe. The ship that departed Hamburg in June 1854 carried 847 passengers, nearly all of them German, packed into steerage accommodations that offered roughly 6 feet by 2 feet of space per person. The crossing to New York would take between 6 and 8 weeks, depending on weather and winds. Among the passengers were farmers from Bavaria who'd lost their land, craftsmen from Saxony whose guilds were collapsing under industrialization, political radicals fleeing reaction after the failed revolutions of 1848, and families simply seeking opportunity in a land they'd heard offered cheap farmland and religious freedom. What they shared, beyond language and desperation, was a cultural memory of food, including the simple ground beef preparations they'd eaten in Germany. Between 1840 and 1880, more than 4 million Germans immigrated to the United States, making them the largest immigrant group of that period. The first wave, in the 1840s and early 1850s, was driven by agricultural crisis. Potato blights, crop failures, and rural overpopulation made survival increasingly difficult for small farmers. The second wave, following the failed revolutions of 1848, brought political refugees and skilled workers whose trades were being undermined by industrialization. The third wave, from the 1860s through 1880s, came seeking economic opportunity as Germany's own industrial revolution displaced traditional livelihoods. These immigrants didn't scatter randomly across America. They congregated in particular cities and regions where earlier German arrivals had established communities, where German was spoken in shops and churches, where a newcomer could find work through connections and feel less alien in a foreign land. Cincinnati, by 1850, was nearly half German. The city's meatpacking industry, the largest in America before Chicago's rise, attracted German butchers who found familiar work in its slaughterhouses and processing plants. Milwaukee's German population grew so large that the city was nicknamed the German Athens of America. By 1860, Germans made up half of Milwaukee's population. St. Louis, positioned at the junction of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, became another major German center, with entire neighborhoods where English was rarely heard. Chicago's German population exploded particularly after the Great Fire of 1871. The city's reconstruction drew workers from across Europe and America, but Germans came in especially large numbers, many of them settling in the North Side neighborhoods that would become centers of German-American culture for generations. By 1880, Chicago's German-born population exceeded 75,000, with perhaps 3 times that many German Americans of the second generation. These communities created a demand for familiar food, and German butchers and restaurant owners were eager to supply it. The Hamburg-style beef patty arrived in America in the luggage, cultural rather than physical, of these immigrants. German butchers who set up shop in Cincinnati or Milwaukee naturally prepared the ground beef dishes they had learned as apprentices in Germany. The techniques were identical: coarse ground beef from tougher cuts, simply seasoned with salt and pepper, formed into thick patties and pan-fried. What changed was the context. In Hamburg, this had been dock worker food, sold from simple cookhouses in working-class neighborhoods. In America, it appeared on the menus of German restaurants and beer gardens that catered to a broader clientele. The German beer garden became a central institution of German-American life. These were large establishments, often with outdoor seating under shade trees, where families gathered on weekend afternoons and evenings. They served German beer, lager primarily, which German brewers had introduced to America and which was rapidly becoming the country's dominant beer style. And they served German food: sauerkraut and sausages, potato salad, pretzels, rye bread, and various beef preparations. Hamburger steak appeared on these menus as a plated entree, served with fried onions, boiled potatoes, and perhaps pickled vegetables. The dish cost about 10 cents, affordable for working men, but more expensive than street food. The term hamburger steak itself became standardized in German-American restaurants during the 1860s and 1870s. German speakers would have called it Hamburger Rundstück or Hamburger Rindsteak, but on English-language menus, the simpler hamburger steak communicated clearly enough. Americans who'd never been to Hamburg understood this was a German beef preparation, something distinct from American beefsteak. The novelty had appeal. German cuisine was respectable, associated with cleanliness, order, and substance. German restaurants attracted not just German immigrants, but also native-born Americans curious about these foreign foods. The adaptation to American ingredients and tastes happened gradually. American beef was different from German beef. Grass-fed cattle from western ranges produced leaner meat with different flavor than the grain-finished cattle of German farms. German-American butchers adjusted their preparations, sometimes adding a little more fat to compensate for leaner American meat. The black pepper available in America was often fresher and more pungent than what they'd used in Germany, where pepper had traveled longer distances before reaching market. Some butchers began adding small amounts of onion to the meat mixture, a practice that had been regional in Germany but became more common in America. The plated hamburger steak of this period bore little resemblance to what we'd recognize as a hamburger. It was larger, often half a pound of meat or more. It was served with knife and fork on a ceramic plate. It came with side dishes and was considered a full meal, not a quick bite. The idea of putting it on a bun hadn't emerged yet, though bread was always on the table at German restaurants, and surely some diners used bread to sop up meat juices, or even to make impromptu sandwiches. But the sandwich form wasn't standard, wasn't on menus, wasn't what you ordered when you asked for hamburger steak. Other immigrant groups brought their own ground meat traditions to America during this same period. Swedish immigrants who settled heavily in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois brought köttbullar, meatballs typically made with a mixture of beef and pork, seasoned with allspice and nutmeg, served with cream sauce. Italian immigrants, arriving in increasing numbers after 1880, brought polpette and the tradition of adding ground meat to tomato sauce for pasta. These preparations coexisted in America's immigrant neighborhoods, each community maintaining its own culinary identity, while slowly beginning to influence each other. The Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, arriving in large numbers beginning in the 1880s, brought their own relationship with ground beef, shaped by kosher dietary laws. Ground beef offered an economical way to feed families while adhering to restrictions about which animals could be eaten and how they must be slaughtered. Jewish delicatessens in New York and other cities served ground beef preparations that bore some similarities to the German hamburger steak, but were distinctly their own tradition, often more heavily spiced and always carefully sourced from kosher butchers. The American beef industry itself was undergoing transformation during this period that would prove crucial to the hamburger's eventual ubiquity. Before the Civil War, beef had been relatively expensive and consumed primarily in cities near cattle-raising regions. The expansion of railroads, the opening of western ranges to cattle grazing, and the development of refrigerated rail cars in the 1870s changed everything. Chicago emerged as the nation's meatpacking center, its Union stockyards processing millions of cattle annually by the 1880s. Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour built vast packing empires, industrializing every aspect of meat processing. This industrialization meant cheaper beef and, crucially, enormous quantities of what the industry called manufacturing meat, the trimmings, odd cuts, and tougher portions that weren't suitable for sale as premium cuts. This meat was perfect for grinding. Large packing companies began selling ground beef in bulk to butchers and restaurants. The price dropped steadily through the 1870s and 1880s. What had been working-class food in Germany became even more accessible in America. A pound of ground beef that might have cost 15 cents in 1860 cost 8 or 10 cents by 1885, within reach of most urban working families. German-American butchers were perfectly positioned to take advantage of this cheap ground beef. They had the knowledge and reputation for preparing it well. They had established shops in German neighborhoods and increasingly in mixed neighborhoods where their quality attracted non-German customers. They understood that ground beef wasn't just cheaper than premium cuts. It could be prepared quickly, sold throughout the day, and appealed to customers looking for something substantial but not elaborate. The technological infrastructure supporting this ground beef boom was also German in origin. Meat grinders, which had existed in crude forms for centuries, were refined and commercialized in the mid-19th century, largely by German manufacturers. The hand-cranked cast-iron grinder became standard equipment in butcher shops in the 1850s and 1860s. These devices could grind meat much more consistently and efficiently than the traditional method of chopping with cleavers. A butcher could grind 20 pounds of beef in the time it had once taken to grind 5. This efficiency made fresh ground beef more practical as an everyday item rather than an occasional preparation. By 1880, hamburger steak had become an established item in urban America, particularly in cities with large German populations. Newspaper advertisements from this period showed German restaurants promoting their hamburger steak specials. Hotel dining rooms, seeking to offer variety on their menus, added hamburger steak as a moderately priced option between cheap hash and expensive roast beef. The dish was moving beyond ethnic food into broader American restaurant culture, though it retained its German association and its plated knife and fork format. What hadn't yet happened was the innovation that would transform hamburger steak into the hamburger, the bun. That development was brewing in the 1880s, emerging from the intersection of several trends: the rise of quick lunch establishments, the American appetite for portable food, the county fair culture where vendors experimented with foods that could be eaten while walking, and the simple, practical insight that people who worked with their hands didn't always have access to plates and utensils. The German immigrants had successfully transplanted their ground beef tradition to American soil. Now American conditions, American pace, American innovation, American informality were about to transform that tradition into something new. The transformation of the hamburger steak from a plated meal into a sandwich happened not in a single moment of inspiration, but through multiple, simultaneous innovations across America in the 1880s and 1890s. Several towns and individuals would later claim to have invented the hamburger, and the historical record is fragmentary enough that none of these claims can be definitively proven or disproven. What we can say with certainty is that the innovation emerged from working-class food culture, from establishments serving people who needed to eat quickly and cheaply, and that the idea of putting ground beef between bread was so practical and obvious that multiple people likely arrived at it independently. Lewis's lunch in New Haven, Connecticut, claims the earliest verifiable date. Louis Lassen, a Danish immigrant, operated a small lunch wagon serving workers from nearby factories. According to family history, in 1900, a customer rushed in asking for something he could eat quickly without utensils. Lassen took a beef patty he'd been preparing, placed it between 2 slices of toasted bread, and handed it over. The story has the ring of plausibility. It fits the pattern of innovation driven by practical necessity. Louis' Lunch still operates today, still serves hamburgers on toast rather than buns, and still claims 1900 as the invention date. But the claim wasn't made publicly until the 1980s, and no contemporary documentation confirms it. Charlie Nagreen of Seymour, Wisconsin, claimed to have invented the hamburger in 1885 when he was 15 years old. Nagreen operated a food stand at the Outagamie County Fair, selling meatballs. When customers complained they couldn't walk around the fair while eating meatballs, he flattened the meatballs into patties and put them between slices of bread. Nagreen called his creation a hamburger and returned to the fair every year until his death in 1951, promoting Seymour's claim. The town erected a hamburger monument in 1989. Again, the story is plausible. County fairs were venues of food innovation throughout the late 19th century. But documentary evidence from the 1880s is absent. Frank and Charles Menches, brothers who operated food concessions at fairs and events across the Midwest, claimed they invented the hamburger at the 1885 Erie County Fair in Hamburg, New York. According to their account, they'd run out of pork sausage and substituted ground beef, serving it on a bun. They named it after the town. This story has several problems. Hamburg, New York, was not a major town. The timing seems convenient, and the Menches brothers' own accounts varied over the years. But it follows the pattern: county fair, food vendor, practical substitution leading to innovation. Fletcher Davis of Athens, Texas, has supporters claiming he invented the hamburger in the 1880s and served it at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Davis operated a lunch counter in Athens and allegedly put ground beef patties on bread there before bringing the concept to St. Louis. The evidence is thin. Newspaper articles decades later, based on recollections of elderly townspeople. But Athens took its claim seriously enough to hold an annual hamburger festival for years. What unites all these origin stories is their setting. Not fancy restaurants or hotel dining rooms, but lunch wagons, county fair stands, working-class lunch counters. These were establishments serving people who worked with their hands, who had limited time for meals, who couldn't afford elaborate dining. The innovation of putting the beef patty on bread wasn't culinary sophistication. It was practical problem-solving. How do you serve hot food to someone who needs to keep moving, who doesn't have time to sit down, who may not even have clean hands? The sandwich format solved multiple problems simultaneously. It made the beef patty portable. A customer could buy it and walk away, eating while returning to work or moving through a fairground. It eliminated the need for plates, utensils, or table service, which reduced the vendor's equipment and labor costs. The bread served as an edible holder, insulating the customer's hands from the hot meat, and crucially, the bread absorbed the meat's juices, preventing drips and making the whole thing tidier to eat. These advantages were so significant that once the idea emerged, it spread rapidly. The specific choice between bread slices and buns reflected regional availability and vendor preference. Some early hamburger sellers used regular bread slices, which were universally available and cheap. Others used buns, round yeast rolls that had become common in German-American bakeries. The bun had the advantage of being already separated into top and bottom, easier to handle and more substantial than standard bread slices. By the early 1900s, buns were becoming the standard, though regional variations persisted. The preparation methods varied considerably in these early years. Some vendors used the traditional Hamburg-style patty, coarse ground, thick, simply seasoned. Others ground the meat finer, made thinner patties that cooked faster, or added onions, breadcrumbs, or eggs to the mixture. Some grilled the patties, Others pan-fried them. Toppings were minimal, perhaps a slice of raw onion, maybe a pickle, occasionally a tomato slice in summer. Condiments, when offered at all, were mustard or ketchup, both of which were becoming increasingly common in American cuisine. The variety reflected the sandwich form's newness. No standard had yet been established. Industrial workers proved to be the primary market for this innovation. Factories in the late 19th century typically provided no lunch facilities. Workers either brought food from home, went to nearby saloons that offered free lunch with purchase of beer, or patronized street vendors and lunch carts that clustered near factory gates. The hamburger sandwich fit perfectly into this ecosystem. It cost a nickel, within reach of men earning $1 or $2 for a 10 or 12-hour shift. It was filling enough to sustain an afternoon of physical labor, and it required no time for sit-down eating. Lunch wagons became crucial vectors for the hamburger spread. These mobile food carts, pulled by horses to positions near factories, construction sites, and business districts, had proliferated in American cities since the 1870s. They typically served simple fare, coffee, sandwiches, pie, soup, to working men at all hours. The hamburger sandwich was ideal lunch wagon food. The patties could be cooked on a small griddle. The ingredients were cheap and didn't spoil quickly, and the product commanded a premium over plain sandwiches while still being affordable. By the late 1890s, lunch wagons in industrial cities across the Northeast and Midwest were adding hamburgers to their offerings. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, the World's Fair that drew nearly 20 million visitors, marked a crucial moment in the hamburger's popularization, regardless of whether it was invented there. Multiple food vendors at the fair served hamburger sandwiches. Visitors from across America and around the world encountered the concept, many for the first time. The fair was a showcase of American innovation and culture, and the hamburger, whether New Haven's, Seymour's, Athens, or someone else's, was presented as part of that American identity. The fair's influence on American eating habits was profound. It popularized or introduced the ice cream cone, peanut butter, cotton candy, and Dr. Pepper to national audiences. The hamburger benefited from this exposure. Fairgoers who tried hamburgers in St. Louis returned home looking for them. Entrepreneurs who'd seen hamburger vendors doing brisk business at the fair opened hamburger stands in their own cities. The concept spread from the Midwest and Northeast into the South and West. Regional variations emerged as the hamburger spread. In the Southwest, chili and cheese became popular additions. In California, vegetables and lettuce appeared more frequently, reflecting the state's agricultural abundance and the influence of a health-conscious culture, even in this early period. In the South, the patties were sometimes prepared with more aggressive seasoning, cayenne pepper, hot sauce mixed into the meat. These variations reflected local tastes and available ingredients, but the basic format remained consistent: ground beef patty, bun, or bread, served hot. The name itself, hamburger, had solidified by the early 1900s, though its precise origin remains unclear. It clearly derived from hamburger steak, which in turn referenced Hamburg, Germany. But the transition from hamburger steak to simply hamburger for the sandwich form happened gradually through common usage rather than through any deliberate coining. By 1904, the term hamburger for a ground beef sandwich was appearing in print with increasing frequency, no longer needing explanation. Street vendors and small lunch counters dominated hamburger sales in this period. These weren't restaurants in any conventional sense. They were minimal operations with a griddle, perhaps a counter with a few stools, selling food through a window or door. The capital investment required was minimal. An ambitious worker could save a few $100s, buy or build a small cart or stand, and go into business for himself. This low barrier to entry meant hamburger vendors proliferated rapidly in working-class neighborhoods and industrial districts. The hamburger remained firmly working-class food throughout this period. Middle-class Americans still ate at proper restaurants with tablecloths and waiters, or prepared meals at home where women's labor made elaborate cooking possible. The Hamburgers association with street food, with rush and convenience, with eating standing up or walking, marked it as lower class. Social reformers worried about the cleanliness of street food and about men spending their lunch money at vendor carts rather than bringing food from home. The hamburger, like other street foods, operated somewhat outside respectable society. This working-class identity would persist for decades, but the seeds of change were already present. The hamburger's very efficiency and affordability gave it a potential market far beyond industrial workers. The sandwich format had proven itself brilliantly successful, portable, tidy, satisfying, cheap to produce and sell. What the hamburger needed for its next transformation was standardization, scale, and someone willing to build a business model around these humble sandwiches. That would come in the 1920s, but the essential innovation, the sandwich itself, was now complete. Ground beef, which had traveled from Central Asian steppes through medieval Europe to Hamburg's port to German-American restaurants, had found its final form. Meat between bread, held in hand, consumed standing, fueling the workers who were building industrial America. The opening decades of the 20th century witnessed the transformation of American food production from a collection of local, small-scale operations into an industrialized system of unprecedented scale and efficiency. Nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in beef processing, and nowhere did it have more profound implications than for ground beef, the raw material of the hamburger. The same industrial forces that were reshaping steel production, automobile manufacturing, and textile mills were about to be applied to the humble beef patty, with results that would make the hamburger not just popular, but ubiquitous. Chicago's Union stockyards stood at the center of this transformation. By 1900, the stockyards covered more than a square mile and processed nearly 20 million animals annually. The major packers, Swift, Armour, Morris, and Wilson, had perfected what they called the disassembly line. Cattle moved through the plants on overhead rails, and workers stationed at intervals performed single, specialized tasks. One man killed, the next bled, another removed the hide, and so on through dozens of stations until an entire steer had been reduced to individual cuts of meat in a matter of minutes. The efficiency was staggering, and the volume of meat produced dropped prices dramatically. For ground beef specifically, this industrial system created ideal conditions. The disassembly process generated enormous quantities of trim, pieces too small, too fatty, or too irregular to sell as premium cuts. This trim had always existed, but pre-industrial butchers had dealt with it in small quantities, using it for sausages or selling it cheap. Industrial packers had trim by the ton, and they needed markets for it. Ground beef, which could absorb all this trim, became increasingly important to their profit margins. They began grinding beef themselves in their plants, using mechanical grinders far larger than any butcher shop's equipment. The mechanization of grinding itself had accelerated in the late 19th century. Hand-cranked grinders gave way to electric models by the early 1900s. These machines could grind hundreds of pounds per hour, maintaining consistent texture impossible to achieve by hand. More importantly, mechanical grinding was faster and cheaper than hand labor, which meant ground beef could be produced profitably at ever lower prices. By 1910, ground beef cost half what it had 20 years earlier, adjusted for inflation. This price drop was crucial. It made ground beef not just affordable, but genuinely cheap, the cheapest animal protein available to urban working-class families. Refrigeration technology evolved rapidly during this period, solving ground beef's inherent spoilage problem. Mechanical refrigeration, which had existed in limited forms since the 1870s, became more reliable and widespread in the 1900s and 1910s. Refrigerated railroad cars could now transport meat reliably from Chicago to cities across the country. The major packers built networks of refrigerated warehouses and distribution centers. Urban butcher shops and restaurants began installing electric coolers that could maintain proper temperatures consistently. For the first time, ground beef could be distributed widely and stored safely for several days rather than requiring immediate consumption. Despite these technological advances, ground beef and hamburgers faced significant public health concerns. Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel The Jungle, which exposed horrific conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants, had shocked the nation and led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. While the reforms that followed improved conditions somewhat, suspicion of processed meat lingered. Ground beef was particularly suspect because grinding concealed the meat's condition. Spoiled or diseased meat could be disguised by grinding and mixing with fresh meat. Stories circulated, some true and some exaggerated, about what ended up in ground beef. This reputation problem would persist for decades. The Hamburgers Association with street vendors and lunch carts compounded the sanitation concerns. These mobile operations often lacked running water, refrigeration, or any meaningful health oversight. A vendor might leave ground beef unrefrigerated for hours, cook patties on a griddle cleaned irregularly, and handle money and food with the same hands. Municipal health departments, which were just beginning to establish food safety regulations in this period, struggled to monitor the proliferation of mobile food vendors. Middle-class Americans viewed hamburgers with deep suspicion. They were food for men who knew no better, possibly dangerous, certainly not respectable. Into this landscape of cheap ground beef, growing demand, and persistent quality concerns came Walter Anderson and Billy Ingram with an innovation that would prove revolutionary: standardization applied to hamburgers. Anderson, a cook in Wichita, Kansas, had been experimenting with hamburger preparation techniques. In 1916, he began operating a food stand, using a flattened beef patty, cooked quickly on a hot griddle, served on a small bun. His innovation was the cooking method. Smashing the beef flat against the hot griddle created maximum surface contact, producing a well-browned exterior while cooking the thin patty through completely in under 2 minutes. Anderson's method was fast, but he struggled with the same reputation problems that plagued all hamburger vendors. In 1921, he partnered with Billy Ingram, a local real estate agent and insurance broker who brought business acumen to Anderson's cooking skills. Together, they founded White Castle in Wichita, and Ingram's insight would transform not just their business, but the entire hamburger industry. They would overcome the hamburger's disreputable image through obsessive emphasis on cleanliness and standardization. The name itself, White Castle, was carefully chosen. White symbolized purity and cleanliness. Castle suggested strength, permanence, and tradition. Everything about White Castle's operation was designed to counter public skepticism about hamburger sanitation. The buildings, which Ingram designed himself, were small white structures with turrets and crenellations, suggesting castle architecture. Large windows allowed passers-by to see directly into the kitchen, watching burgers being prepared. Employees wore spotless white uniforms and white paper hats. The counters were white porcelain, the equipment stainless steel, everything gleaming and obviously clean. This emphasis on visible cleanliness was revolutionary for the fast food industry, such as it was in 1921. Most lunch counters and diners of the period were dark, often grimy, with cooking happening out of sight. White Castle made cleanliness its central selling point. Signs proclaimed, "Buy 'em by the sack." Newspaper advertisements emphasized sanitary conditions. The company even hired a nutrition researcher from the University of Minnesota to conduct a study in which a medical student ate nothing but White Castle hamburgers for 13 weeks and remained healthy, a publicity stunt designed to counter claims that hamburgers were unwholesome. But cleanliness alone wouldn't have built an empire. Ingram's other crucial innovation was absolute standardization. Every White Castle hamburger was identical. The beef patty weighed exactly the same, about 0.4 ounces, much smaller than the typical hamburger of that era. 5 holes were punched in each patty, allowing steam to escape and ensuring even cooking. The patty was placed on a small bun, topped with a small amount of onion. And that was it. No variations, no substitutions, no customization. A customer in the first White Castle got exactly the same product as a customer in the 20th. This standardization extended to every aspect of the operation. The griddle temperature was specified precisely. Cooking time was timed. The layout of each White Castle unit was identical. Counter, stools, griddle positioned so customers could watch. Employees received training in exact procedures. This wasn't creativity or artisanal craft. This was industrial efficiency applied to food service. Ingram had recognized that the key to success wasn't making the best hamburger, but making the same hamburger reliably, thousands of times per day. The price point was equally important. White Castle charged 5 cents per hamburger, the same nickel that had been standard since the hamburger sandwich's invention. But where street vendors' 5-cent burgers varied wildly in size and quality, White Castle's 5-cent burger was guaranteed. The company could charge this low price because standardization created efficiency. No time wasted on custom orders. No inventory spoilage from offering too many options. High volume with minimal labor costs. The small burger size actually worked in White Castle's favor. Customers often bought multiple burgers, increasing total purchase amounts, while each individual burger remained symbolically affordable at a nickel. The assembly line preparation method that White Castle pioneered drew explicitly from industrial manufacturing principles. Henry Ford's assembly line for automobiles had revolutionized manufacturing starting in 1913, and the concept was widely discussed and emulated across industries by the 1920s. White Castle's preparation was essentially an assembly line: buns arranged in rows, patties placed on griddle, onions added, buns placed on patties, completed burgers removed to wrapping station. During busy periods, workers moved through this sequence continuously, creating a flow of identical products. One worker could produce hundreds of hamburgers per hour. The success was immediate and dramatic. The first White Castle in Wichita was profitable within weeks. Ingram began opening additional locations in Wichita, then expanding to other Kansas cities. By 1924, White Castle operated in Omaha and Kansas City. In 1927, Ingram brought the concept to the larger markets of St. Louis, Minneapolis, and eventually Chicago and New York. The company didn't franchise. Ingram maintained direct ownership and control to ensure standards were met, but the expansion was rapid nonetheless. By 1930, White Castle would operate more than 100 locations. Other entrepreneurs noticed White Castle's success and attempted to replicate it, often with names deliberately echoing the original: White Tower, White Palace, Royal Castle. Some were direct imitators, copying even the castle architecture. Others adapted the core concepts of standardization and cleanliness to their own variations. A small but growing hamburger chain industry emerged in the 1920s, concentrated in Midwestern and Eastern cities, where White Castle had proven the model's viability. The cultural impact of White Castle extended beyond business success. The company's aggressive marketing worked. Hamburgers began losing their disreputable association. Middle-class customers, reassured by visible cleanliness and standardization, began eating hamburgers. Women, who had generally avoided lunch counters and street food, felt comfortable entering White Castle. The company advertised directly to women, emphasizing convenience and economy. A mother could feed her family cheaply at White Castle, and the standardization meant she knew exactly what she was getting. The 5-cent hamburger became embedded in American consciousness during the 1920s as a symbol of modern efficiency and democratic abundance. For a nickel, pocket change, even for working-class families, anyone could get hot, satisfying food, served quickly, in clean surroundings. The hamburger had been democratized even further, made accessible not just to factory workers, but to nearly everyone. This accessibility, combined with standardization that made the product predictable and safe, set the stage for even more explosive growth in the decades to come. By 1991, the hamburger had completed another transformation. It had evolved from working-class street food into the foundation of a new kind of business, the fast food chain. White Castle proved that hamburgers could be systematized, industrialized, and sold at scale while maintaining quality and safety. The next phase would see this model expand dramatically. New competitors emerge, and the hamburger evolve from urban lunch counter food into something approaching a national cuisine. The Great Depression that began with the stock market crash of October 1929 devastated the American economy. By 1933, unemployment reached 25%. Families lost homes, farms, and savings. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. In this landscape of deprivation, the hamburger's affordability became not just convenient, but essential. A White Castle hamburger still cost a nickel, the same price it had been in 1921, and 5 cents could mean the difference between eating and not eating for millions of Americans. Hamburger consumption actually increased during the Depression years, a counterintuitive pattern driven by economic necessity. Families who had previously afforded roasts and chops turned to ground beef as their protein source. White Castle and its competitors saw steady business, even as other restaurants failed. The hamburger chains had positioned themselves for precisely this moment. They offered maximum nutrition per penny spent, served quickly to people who couldn't spare time from searching for work or laboring at whatever jobs they could find. A family of 4 could eat at White Castle for a quarter, less than half what a restaurant meal would cost. The Depression also accelerated ground beef's complete penetration of the American diet. Home cooks who'd once viewed ground beef as inferior learned dozens of ways to stretch it. Meatloaf bulked with bread and oatmeal, hamburger stew with vegetables and potatoes, spaghetti with meat sauce. Community cookbooks from the 1930s devoted entire sections to ground beef recipes. The hamburger, whether eaten at home or purchased from a vendor, became associated with survival, with making do, with the shared experience of economic hardship. This association would later transform into something more positive: the hamburger as democratic, accessible, unpretentious. While the Depression gripped the East and Midwest, a different food culture was emerging in Southern California, shaped by the automobile, warm weather, and a less formal social structure. California's car culture was already well established by the 1930s. Los Angeles had been designed around the automobile, with sprawling suburbs connected by roads rather than concentrated around rail lines. People drove everywhere, and entrepreneurs began building restaurants designed specifically for automobile access, drive-in restaurants where customers could park and be served in their cars. The Pig Stand, which had opened in Dallas in 1921, pioneered the drive-in concept, but California drive-ins refined it through the 1930s. These weren't the drive-thrus that would emerge decades later. Customers parked in marked spaces, and waitresses called car hops came to the car windows to take orders, then brought food on trays that attached to the car door. The menu centered on hamburgers and similar quick items that could be eaten in a car without requiring plates or extensive cleanup. The drive-in combined American love of automobiles with American appetite for convenience. These California drive-ins developed a distinct aesthetic and culture. They featured bold, eye-catching architecture, buildings shaped like castles, chili bowls, or featuring giant neon signs visible from blocks away. They became social gathering spots for teenagers and young adults, places to see and be seen. The drive-in hamburger restaurant became as much about socializing as eating, a place where youth culture and car culture intersected. This was something new. Restaurants as entertainment venues, eating as a social activity separate from the formality of traditional dining. Regional hamburger chains emerged during the 1930s and 1940s, each adapting the standardization model White Castle had pioneered to local conditions and preferences. Bob Wyan opened Bob's Big Boy in Glendale, California, in 1936. His innovation was the double-decker hamburger, 2 patties separated by an extra middle bun section, creating a larger burger that still fit in hand comfortably. The Big Boy became an icon, eventually expanding beyond California to become one of America's first nationwide hamburger chains. Big Boy restaurants were sit-down establishments, larger than White Castle, appealing to families rather than just workers grabbing quick lunch. In Normal, Illinois, Gus Belt opened Steak and Shake in 1934 with a different pitch: premium hamburgers made from genuine steak trimmings, ground in view of customers. The name itself was a promise: real steak, not mystery meat, hand-ground and shaped into burgers. Steak and Shake positioned itself as higher quality than competitors, charging slightly more, but offering a superior product. The concept worked, and Steak and Shake expanded through the Midwest, eventually franchising its operations, one of the first hamburger chains to do so. World War II interrupted civilian restaurant expansion as rationing, labor shortages, and wartime restrictions limited operations. Meat rationing made beef scarce, and hamburger chains struggled with supply limitations. But the war also accelerated cultural changes that would benefit the hamburger industry enormously. Millions of Americans left home for military service or war industry jobs, experiencing different foods and developing more flexible eating habits. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, reducing time available for home cooking. Quick, convenient food became not just appealing, but necessary. The post-war period, beginning in 1945, unleashed the most dramatic economic expansion in American history. Returning servicemen, aided by the GI Bill, bought homes, started families, and sought the prosperity that depression and war had denied. The suburban explosion began immediately, new housing developments spreading around every major city, filled with young families with children and cars. These suburbs were automobile-dependent, built around shopping centers and strip malls, rather than traditional downtown districts. They were ideal territory for hamburger chains. In San Bernardino, California, two brothers named Richard and Morris McDonald had opened a drive-in restaurant in 1940. Like other California drive-ins, the McDonald Brothers restaurant featured car hop service and an extensive menu of barbecue, hamburgers, and other items. But by 1948, the brothers recognized that hamburgers generated most of their profit and that the car hop system was inefficient. They closed their restaurant, redesigned the entire operation, and reopened with a revolutionary concept: the speedy service system. The McDonald brothers had analyzed their operation with industrial efficiency in mind, taking White Castle's standardization even further. They reduced the menu to just hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, soft drinks, milkshakes, and pie. They eliminated car hop service. Customers walked to a window to order. They designed a kitchen that was essentially a purpose-built hamburger assembly line. Food was prepared in full view of customers, emphasizing speed and transparency. The hamburgers were small, simple, just mustard, ketchup, onions, and pickles, and cheap, 15 cents, 3 times White Castle's original nickel price, but still far less than restaurant meals. The kitchen layout was ingenious. The grill occupied the center, surrounded by stations for each component. One worker grilled patties continuously, another assembled buns, another added condiments, another wrapped completed burgers, another handled fries. The system allowed the McDonald brothers to produce hamburgers at unprecedented speed. The name Speedy Service System was accurate marketing. During peak times, they could serve a customer in under 1 minute from order to delivery. The efficiency was Henry Ford's assembly line, perfected for food service. The restaurant was successful beyond the brothers' expectations, and imitators soon appeared throughout Southern California. But the McDonald's themselves had little interest in expansion. They were content with their one highly profitable location. Then, in 1954, Ray Kroc arrived. Kroc was a 52-year-old milkshake machine salesman who'd heard that a single restaurant in San Bernardino was using 8 of his machines simultaneously, an extraordinary volume. He traveled to investigate and recognized immediately what he was seeing, a system that could be replicated nationwide. Kroc convinced the McDonald brothers to let him franchise their concept. His first franchise restaurant opened in Des Plaines, Illinois, in April 1955. Kroc's vision was more ambitious than the McDonald brothers had ever considered. He wanted McDonald's restaurants in every major market in America. But simply franchising the name wasn't enough. Kroc insisted on absolute adherence to the McDonald brothers system. Identical menus, identical procedures, identical standards. Franchisees weren't buying permission to use a name. They were buying a complete operational system and the requirement to follow it precisely. The franchising model, which Kroc would perfect through the late 1950s and 1960s, solved a problem that had limited White Castle's expansion. White Castle owned all its locations directly, which required enormous capital for each new restaurant. Franchising let McDonald's grow using other people's money. Franchisees paid for their own locations, equipment, and operations while paying McDonald's a percentage of revenue. This allowed extraordinarily rapid expansion. By 1959, McDonald's had 100 locations. By 1963, it had 500. The Golden Arches were becoming a familiar sight across American suburbs. Other chains adopted similar franchise models during the 1950s. Burger King, founded in Miami in 1953 as Insta Burger King, began franchising in 1954. Its flame-broiled cooking method distinguished it from McDonald's griddle cooking, but the overall concept was similar. Limited menu, quick service, low prices, standardized operations. Burger King positioned itself as McDonald's primary competitor, and the rivalry between the two chains would drive innovation for decades. In-N-Out Burger, founded in Baldwin Park, California in 1948 by Harry and Esther Snyder, took a different approach. In-N-Out was perhaps the first true drive-through. Customers ordered via a two-way speaker system and received food without leaving their cars. The menu was even more limited than McDonald's: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, and soft drinks only. But In-N-Out emphasized quality over expansion, using fresh ingredients and never freezing beef. The chain expanded slowly, maintained family ownership, and developed an almost cult-like following in California. Existence proved that multiple viable hamburger chain models could coexist. By the end of the 1950s, the hamburger had completed its cultural transformation. What had been working-class food, street vendor fare, slightly disreputable and associated with minimal investment eating, was now all-American. The hamburger chains had made the food respectable. Families ate at McDonald's and Big Boy. Teenagers congregated at drive-ins. The hamburger had been absorbed into the American mainstream so thoroughly that it was becoming difficult to remember when it had been anything else. The suburban geography of post-war America proved perfect for hamburger chains. Strip malls and commercial corridors needed quick-service restaurants. Families with cars and children wanted convenient, affordable food that kids would eat without complaint. Teenagers wanted social spaces less formal than traditional restaurants. The hamburger met all these needs. A McDonald's could serve hundreds of customers per hour, generating revenue that traditional restaurants couldn't match. The 15-cent hamburger and 10-cent fries became standard weekend family outings for millions of families. The standardization that White Castle had pioneered in the 1920s had evolved into a sophisticated system by the late 1950s. McDonald's operations manual specified everything down to burger temperature, fry cooking time, and proper greeting language. This obsessive standardization made expansion possible without quality degradation. It also changed American expectations about food service. Increasingly, customers expected every experience at a chain restaurant to be identical to their previous experience. Variation, once expected and accepted, became a sign of failure. The hamburger had become industrialized food in the fullest sense, standardized, systematized, mass-produced. The connection to Hamburg, Germany, to German immigrant butchers, to medieval meat preparation techniques, had faded almost completely from consciousness. The hamburger was American now, as American as automobiles and suburbs and shopping centers, embedded in the culture so deeply that the next generation of Americans would grow up unable to imagine a world without it. The 1960s opened with roughly 200 McDonald's restaurants scattered across the United States, most concentrated in California and the Midwest. By decade's end, that number would exceed 1,000, and Ray Kroc's vision of a McDonald's in every American community was becoming reality. The explosive growth wasn't accidental. It was engineered through innovations in business structure, marketing, and real estate that would establish the template not just for hamburger chains, but for franchise businesses of all kinds. The hamburger was entering its golden age, and McDonald's was leading the charge. Kroc's genius extended beyond recognizing the McDonald Brothers system. He understood that a hamburger chain's real business wasn't selling hamburgers, but managing real estate. In 1956, Kroc established Franchise Realty Corporation, which would purchase or lease restaurant sites and then sublease them to franchisees at markup. This provided McDonald's corporate with steady income independent of restaurant sales and gave the company leverage over franchisees. If a franchisee failed to maintain standards, McDonald's could terminate the franchise and still own the valuable real estate. This model made McDonald's one of America's largest property owners and provided capital for aggressive expansion. The interstate highway system, launched in 1956 and expanding rapidly through the 1960s, proved crucial to the hamburger chain's nationalization. The interstates created standardized travel corridors across America, and travelers needed familiar places to eat. A family driving from Chicago to Florida could stop at McDonald's in Tennessee, knowing exactly what they'd receive: the same burgers, same fries, same service as their neighborhood McDonald's back home. This reliability was valuable enough that chains began competing for interstate locations, understanding that highway visibility translated directly to revenue. Franchise agreements became increasingly sophisticated during the 1960s. McDonald's, learning from early mistakes, imposed rigorous standards on franchisees. Prospective franchisees attended Hamburger University. Yes, that was its actual name, at McDonald's headquarters in Illinois, where they received intensive training in every aspect of operations. They learned proper burger assembly, optimal fry temperature, customer service protocols, cleaning procedures, and management techniques. The week-long program transformed hamburger preparation from learned skill to systematic process that anyone could master through instruction. Burger King, McDonald's primary competitor, grew rapidly during the 1960s by differentiating itself through product rather than just competing on McDonald's terms. In 1957, Burger King introduced the Whopper, a larger hamburger, quarter pound versus McDonald's smaller patties, flame-broiled instead of griddled, and customizable with the slogan, "Have it your way." Introduced in 1974. The Whopper cost more than a McDonald's hamburger, but appealed to customers wanting something more substantial. By positioning itself as the premium alternative to McDonald's, Burger King carved out sustainable market share. The company franchised aggressively, reaching 250 locations by 1967 and more than 1,000 by the mid-1970s. The late 1960s saw menu innovation emerge as a competitive strategy. McDonald's had maintained a remarkably limited menu since its founding, the original items plus a few additions. In 1968, a franchisee named Jim Delegati in Pittsburgh developed a new burger: 2 beef patties on a 3-layer bun with lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions, and a special sauce. He called it the Big Mac. The sandwich was larger than standard McDonald's burgers, but still handheld, addressing customer desires for more substantial offerings. McDonald's corporate tested it nationally, found success, and added it system-wide. The Big Mac became iconic. Its 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun jingle became embedded in American consciousness. Television advertising transformed hamburger chains from regional businesses into cultural phenomena during the 1960s. McDonald's advertising budget exploded from modest local expenditures to national campaigns costing millions annually. The company targeted children specifically, introducing Ronald McDonald in 1963. The clown character appeared in local markets initially, then nationally, building brand loyalty among children who would beg parents to visit McDonald's. This marketing to children was innovative and effective, and would later draw criticism. But in the 1960s, it simply seemed like smart business. Children represented future lifetime customers. Burger King's advertising countered with appeals to adult preferences, emphasizing flame broiling and customization. Have it your way. Advertising suggested McDonald's assembly line approach was impersonal, while Burger King respected individual preferences. Wendy's, founded by Dave Thomas in Columbus, Ohio, in 1969, would later position itself as the quality alternative, using fresh beef rather than frozen and offering a more upscale, though still quick service, experience. The hamburger market was segmenting, with chains appealing to different demographics and preferences. The cultural significance of hamburgers during the 1960s extended far beyond mere food. The hamburger, particularly McDonald's, became a symbol of American prosperity, efficiency, and modernity. Foreign visitors commented on the speed and affordability of American fast food. American soldiers serving in Vietnam spoke longingly of hamburgers and milkshakes. The hamburger represented normalcy, home, comfort, American identity distilled into food form. When anthropologists and sociologists studied American culture, they increasingly noted fast food as a defining characteristic, something that distinguished American life from other developed nations. International expansion began tentatively in the late 1960s. McDonald's opened in Canada in 1967, a relatively easy first step given cultural similarities and geographic proximity. But the 1971 opening in Tokyo represented something more significant. Could American hamburger culture transplant to a nation with fundamentally different food traditions? The answer proved to be a resounding yes. Japanese consumers, particularly young people, embraced McDonald's as modern and Western. The hamburger became associated with progress and international sophistication. McDonald's Japan adapted slightly, smaller burgers, teriyaki sauce options, but maintained core standardization. European expansion followed similar patterns. McDonald's opened in the Netherlands in 1971, Germany in 1971, and gradually across Western Europe through the 1970s. Each market required adaptations: beer in German McDonald's, wine in French locations, but the core product remained consistent. The hamburger was being exported as American culture, and much of the world was eager to consume it. Critics would later decry this cultural imperialism, but in the early 1970s, the dominant narrative was simply successful business expansion. Youth culture's embrace of fast food was nearly complete by the mid-1970s. Teenagers who'd grown up with McDonald's and Burger King felt none of their parents' or grandparents' working-class associations with hamburgers. For them, fast food was simply normal, the default option for casual eating. Drive-thrus, which became increasingly common in the 1970s, added convenience. Customers could get food without leaving cars. The drive-thru window, which McDonald's and other chains standardized in the 1970s, represented the logical conclusion of the drive-in evolution: maximum speed with minimal interaction. The economic model that enabled this explosive growth was increasingly clear by the 1970s. Success depended on volume. Individual hamburgers generated tiny profits, but selling thousands per day per location created substantial revenue. Franchising provided expansion capital while maintaining control through strict operational requirements. Real estate holdings appreciated while generating rental income. Advertising built brand value that protected against competition. The model was so successful that it attracted imitators far beyond hamburgers. Pizza chains, chicken chains, taco chains all adopted variations of the McDonald's franchise structure. Labor practices within hamburger chains created a new category of American worker: the fast food employee. These jobs required minimal skills, paid minimum wage, and offered no career path. They were designed to be temporary, filled by teenagers or others seeking supplementary income. The work was repetitive, closely supervised, and often unpleasant. But the chain's appetite for labor was enormous, and they became major employers of young people. By the mid-1970s, a teenager's first job was likely to be at a hamburger chain, an experience that would be shared by millions of Americans over subsequent decades. Menu expansion continued through the 1970s as chains sought competitive advantages. McDonald's added breakfast items, eventually launching the Egg McMuffin nationwide in 1975. Burger King introduced specialty burgers, chicken sandwiches, and salad bars. Wendy's, expanding rapidly from its 1969 founding, positioned itself through quality claims: square patties to show they weren't cutting corners, fresh beef never frozen, baked potatoes as a healthier side option. These innovations remained within fast food parameters: quick preparation, low cost, high volume. But they diversified offerings and gave chains multiple ways to compete. The sheer ubiquity of hamburger chains by the late 1970s was remarkable. McDonald's alone operated more than 5,000 locations by 1978. Adding Burger King, Wendy's, regional chains like Jack in the Box and Hardee's, and countless independent hamburger restaurants, Americans had access to hamburgers on a scale unimaginable just 20 years earlier. Nearly every highway exit offered multiple hamburger options. Every shopping center included at least one hamburger chain. Suburbs were designed assuming automobile access to fast food restaurants. The hamburger's journey from Hamburg's port workers to global cultural icon was essentially complete by decade's end. German immigrants would have barely recognized what their hamburger steak had become. Smaller, simpler, served in paper wrappings by teenagers in uniforms, marketed by clowns and mascots, sold by corporations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The connection to its origins had been severed almost entirely. The hamburger was American now, and America was exporting it worldwide as a package of convenience, efficiency, and modernity. But success at this scale inevitably generated consequences. The same standardization and industrialization that made hamburgers cheap and ubiquitous had effects that extended far beyond restaurant economics. The environmental impact of industrial beef production, the nutritional implications of regular fast food consumption, the labor conditions within the industry, the cultural homogenization as local food traditions gave way to global chains. These concerns were beginning to surface by the late 1970s. The Golden Age was approaching its peak, and the questions that would define the next phase were already being asked, though not yet loudly enough to slow the industry's momentum. The warnings began quietly, in medical journals and nutrition research papers that the general public rarely read. Throughout the 1970s, as hamburger chains continued their explosive growth, a different narrative was developing in academic and public health circles. Researchers were beginning to document connections between dietary patterns and chronic disease, and the American diet, increasingly centered on fast food, was raising concerns. The hamburger, that symbol of American prosperity and efficiency, was starting to look like it might carry hidden costs. In 1977, the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, chaired by Senator George McGovern, released Dietary Goals for the United States, a report that recommended Americans reduce consumption of meat, particularly fatty meat, along with saturated fat, cholesterol, salt, and sugar. The report was controversial. The meat and dairy industries fought it aggressively, and subsequent editions were modified in response to industry pressure. But the core message was clear. The typical American diet, heavy on hamburgers and other fast food, was contributing to heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic conditions. Nutritionists had understood for decades that diet affected health, but the 1970s saw this understanding crystallize into specific concerns about fast food. A typical fast food meal, hamburger, fries, and soft drink, delivered roughly 1,200 calories, much of it from saturated fat and refined carbohydrates, with minimal nutritional value beyond basic macronutrients. The sodium content was extraordinarily high, often exceeding half the recommended daily intake in a single meal. For someone eating fast food occasionally, this wasn't particularly concerning. But Americans were eating fast food, not occasionally, but regularly, multiple times per week for many families, daily for some individuals. Studies began appearing in medical literature, connecting frequent hamburger consumption to elevated cholesterol levels and increased cardiovascular disease risk. A 1979 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that ground beef's fat content, combined with high-heat cooking methods that produced potentially carcinogenic compounds, created multiple health concerns. The researchers were careful to note that moderate consumption wasn't dangerous, but moderate was becoming rarer as fast food became a dietary staple rather than an occasional indulgence. The ground beef itself presented specific concerns beyond general meat consumption issues. Grinding increased surface area and could distribute bacteria throughout the meat, unlike whole cuts where bacteria remained on the exterior and were killed during cooking. In 1982, researchers identified a particular strain of E. coli bacteria, O157H7, that caused severe illness and was particularly associated with undercooked ground beef. The bacterium had likely existed for years, but changes in industrial beef processing and the sheer volume of ground beef being consumed made contamination more consequential. Small outbreaks occurred through the 1980s, usually traced to undercooked hamburgers, though these incidents didn't yet reach public consciousness. Food safety concerns extended beyond bacterial contamination. The industrial beef system that made cheap hamburgers possible relied on enormous feedlots where cattle were fattened quickly on grain-based diets. These concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, packed thousands of cattle into confined spaces, creating conditions that promoted disease and required routine antibiotic use. By the 1980s, concerns about antibiotic resistance stemming from agricultural antibiotic use were emerging in medical literature. The connection to hamburgers was direct. Every burger represented a small sample of this industrial system. Environmental concerns, while less prominent in the 1970s and early 1980s than they would later become, were also being articulated by researchers and activists. Beef production required vastly more land, water, and energy than plant-based protein sources. Cattle ranching was a primary driver of deforestation in Central and South America. As demand for cheap beef grew, the methane produced by cattle digestion contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. A 1981 study calculated that producing a single pound of beef required roughly 2,500 gallons of water when irrigation for feed crops was included. As hamburger chains serve billions of burgers annually, these environmental costs were scaling proportionally. The fast food industry's labor practices came under increasing scrutiny during this period as well. The industry had pioneered what became known as the McJobs phenomenon: low wage, no benefit, high turnover positions with minimal training requirements. Fast food restaurants designed systems that required minimal skill and could operate with constant employee turnover. Workers were easily replaceable, which meant individual employees had no leverage for better wages or conditions. Unions had virtually no presence in the industry. By the mid-1980s, McJob had entered the lexicon as a term for dead-end employment. Teenage workers, who made up a substantial portion of fast food employees, faced particular vulnerabilities. They worked for minimum wage, often without proper training in food safety or workplace safety. Burns from fryers and grills were common. The pressure to work quickly led to shortcuts and accidents. Some franchisees violated child labor laws, requiring teenagers to work excessive hours or during school nights. These issues surfaced in occasional news reports, but generated limited public outrage. Fast food jobs were seen as temporary teenage work, not serious employment deserving of serious concern. The response from hamburger chains to nutritional and health concerns was largely defensive. McDonald's and other major chains commissioned their own studies, which unsurprisingly found their food acceptable when consumed as part of a balanced diet. Industry spokespeople emphasized personal responsibility. Their food wasn't unhealthy. People's choices to eat it excessively were the problem. When pressed about nutritional content, chains pointed to salads and other healthier options they'd added to menus, even though these items represented tiny fractions of sales. The industry's position was essentially that they were meeting consumer demand, and any health consequences were individuals' responsibility. This defensiveness extended to resistance to nutritional labeling. Throughout the 1980s, consumer advocates pushed for requirements that restaurants provide nutritional information. The industry fought these proposals, arguing that menu items varied too much to provide accurate information and that labeling would be impractical and costly. Behind this public argument was likely concern that explicit calorie and fat content information might deter customers. The industry successfully delayed nutritional labeling requirements for decades. Cultural tension emerged between the hamburger's convenience and growing health consciousness. The 1980s saw explosive growth in fitness culture, aerobics classes, running, health clubs, while simultaneously seeing continued fast food expansion. These weren't contradictory for most Americans. They simply compartmentalized. People could eat fast food regularly while also exercising, believing one cancelled out the other. The connection between diet and health outcomes was intellectually understood, but not emotionally integrated into daily behavior for most people. Obesity rates in America began rising noticeably in the early 1980s, though the trend wouldn't be recognized as a major public health crisis until the 1990s. Data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey showed adult obesity increasing from roughly 15% in the late 1970s to nearly 23% by 1990. The causes were multifactorial: sedentary lifestyles, larger portion sizes, increased snacking, soft drink consumption. But fast food was clearly implicated. The convenience and affordability that made hamburger chains successful also made overconsumption easy. Children's consumption of fast food was particularly concerning to researchers. McDonald's aggressive marketing to children through Ronald McDonald, Happy Meals, introduced in 1979, and playground equipment in restaurants built brand loyalty from an early age. Children who grew up eating McDonald's regularly developed preferences and habits that persisted into adulthood. Studies showed that children exposed to heavy fast food marketing consumed more calories and had higher rates of overweight and obesity. The long-term implications were troubling. Children establishing poor dietary patterns early might face obesity and related health issues throughout their lives. The industry's marketing budgets dwarfed anything public health advocates could muster. McDonald's alone spent hundreds of millions annually on advertising by the mid-1980s, saturating television, radio, and print media with messages about fun, convenience, and value. Public health messaging about nutrition reached tiny audiences by comparison. When nutritionists warned about fast food, their voices were drowned out by advertising that made hamburgers seem not just acceptable, but appealing, even wholesome. Some critics began articulating broader concerns about what fast food represented, not just nutritional issues, but cultural homogenization, the erosion of family meals and food traditions, the prioritization of speed and convenience over quality and connection. These arguments resonated with some audiences, but struck others as elitist or nostalgic. Fast food was democratic. everyone could afford it. Traditional food culture often meant hours of female domestic labor. The convenience that critics decried represented liberation for many families, particularly working mothers who couldn't spend hours preparing meals. The tension between individual choice and collective health outcomes became increasingly apparent. Fast food chains argued they simply provided options. No one was forced to eat there. If people chose to eat unhealthily, that was their prerogative. Public health advocates countered that individual choices were shaped by environment, advertising, availability, and economic constraints. When fast food was cheap, convenient, and aggressively marketed while healthier options were expensive and required time and knowledge to prepare, calling the results individual choice seemed to ignore systemic factors. By the late 1980s, the consequences of fast food success were becoming visible enough that they could no longer be completely ignored. Obesity rates were climbing. Heart disease remained America's leading killer, with diet as a primary risk factor. Diabetes rates were increasing. The industrial food system's environmental impact was being documented more thoroughly. Labor conditions in fast food were being compared unfavorably to other industries. But the industry itself was stronger than ever, politically connected, economically powerful, deeply embedded in American culture and daily life. The hamburger had become too big to fail, in a sense. Millions of jobs depended on hamburger chains. The industry generated billions in economic activity. Entire supply chains, beef production, bun manufacturing, produce growing, were structured around fast food demand. Any serious attempt to regulate or restrict the industry would face massive resistance, not just from the chains themselves, but from all the economic interests connected to them. The unintended consequences of the hamburger's success were becoming clear, but the momentum of that success made addressing those consequences extraordinarily difficult. The stage was set for a more public reckoning in the decades ahead, when the concerns that had been percolating in academic journals and health departments would burst into broader public consciousness. But in the 1980s, despite the warnings, despite the emerging evidence, the hamburger's march forward continued essentially unchecked. The golden arches kept rising, the burgers kept selling, and the consequences kept accumulating, visible to those who looked closely, but not yet loud enough to penetrate the noise of advertising and convenience. The crisis that had been building quietly through the 1980s exploded into public consciousness in January 1993, when children began arriving at hospitals in Washington state with bloody diarrhea and severe abdominal pain. Within days, health officials had identified the source: undercooked hamburgers served at Jack in the Box restaurants. The pathogen was E. coli 0157 H7, the same bacterium researchers had been warning about for a decade. Before the outbreak ended, more than 700 people fell ill across 4 states. 4 children died, including a 2-year-old boy. Dozens more suffered permanent kidney and brain damage. The Jack in the Box outbreak shattered the fast food industry's carefully cultivated image of safety and cleanliness. Television news showed anguished parents describing their children's suffering. Investigators traced the contamination to meat supplied by a distributor serving multiple Jack in the Box locations. The meat had been contaminated during processing. A small amount of infected beef mixed with thousands of pounds of clean meat, then distributed across the supply chain. This was the nightmare scenario that centralized meat processing made possible. A single point of contamination could sicken people across multiple states. Jack in the Box's response was initially defensive, blaming suppliers and cooking procedures. But the damage was catastrophic. The company's stock price collapsed. Customers abandoned the chain. Jack in the Box faced hundreds of lawsuits and eventually paid more than $50 million in settlements. More significantly, the outbreak forced public attention onto how hamburger meat was actually produced. Americans learned about industrial meat processing, the grinding together of meat from hundreds or thousands of cattle, the potential for contamination to spread throughout batches, the reliance on cooking to kill bacteria rather than preventing contamination in the first place. The outbreak prompted regulatory changes, though less sweeping than public health advocates hoped. The USDA declared E. coli 0157 HH7 an adulterant in ground beef, meaning any meat containing it could be seized. Testing requirements increased. But the fundamental structure of industrial meat processing remained unchanged, still centralized, still grinding meat from many animals together, still dependent on proper cooking to ensure safety. The industry argued that the system worked if everyone followed protocols. Critics countered that a system requiring perfection at every stage was inherently unsafe. Mad cow disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, created the next major scare in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The disease, which emerged in British cattle in the 1980s and could transmit to humans as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, was terrifying. It was invariably fatal, had no treatment, and had already killed more than 150 people in Britain. Though no cases had been confirmed in American cattle by 2000, the possibility terrified consumers. When a single case of mad cow disease was confirmed in Washington state in December 2003, beef consumption dropped immediately. Fast food chains scrambled to assure customers their beef was safe, but trust had been shaken. The nutritional reckoning arrived with the 2001 publication of Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, The Dark Side of the All-American Meal. The book was meticulously researched, investigative journalism examining every aspect of the fast food industry: labor practices, meat processing, marketing to children, franchising economics, and health impacts. Schlosser connected dots that had previously existed in isolation, showing how the hamburger chain's business model created cascading consequences. The book became a bestseller, spent months on the New York Times bestseller list, and brought fast food criticism into mainstream discourse. Schlosser's impact was amplified by his readable prose and compelling narrative. He wasn't preaching from a health food perspective. He was reporting facts about an industry whose practices, when examined closely, were disturbing. The chapters on meat processing were particularly shocking. Descriptions of slaughterhouse conditions, worker injuries, and the speed-focused system that made contamination likely. The section on marketing to children documented how chains deliberately cultivated brand loyalty in young children. Middle-class parents who'd thought nothing of frequent McDonald's visits began reconsidering. In 2004, filmmaker Morgan Spurlock released Super Size Me, a documentary in which he ate nothing but McDonald's food for 30 days while doctors monitored his health. The results were dramatic. Spurlock gained 24 pounds. His cholesterol spiked. He experienced mood swings and depression, and his liver showed signs of damage. The film was somewhat stunt journalism, but it resonated with audiences. It made visceral and visual what nutritionists had been saying for years. Regular fast food consumption damaged health. Super Size Me grossed more than $20 million and earned an Academy Award nomination, guaranteeing wide exposure. McDonald's response to Super Size Me was telling. The company announced it was eliminating supersize options from menus, though it claimed the decision was unrelated to the film. The company also began emphasizing salads and fruit options more heavily in advertising. But these were cosmetic changes. The core business remained selling hamburgers, fries, and soft drinks, and those items still constituted the vast majority of sales. The industry had learned that appearing responsive was important, even if fundamental operations remained unchanged. Obesity rates continued their alarming climb through the 1990s and 2000s. By 2000, roughly 30% of American adults were obese, double the rate from 1980. Childhood obesity had increased even more dramatically. The health implications were staggering. Increased rates of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, certain cancers. Medical costs associated with obesity-related conditions reached tens of billions annually. While fast food wasn't the sole cause, sedentary lifestyles, larger portion sizes across all eating contexts, and increased snacking all contributed. It was clearly a major factor. Research solidified the connections between fast food consumption and obesity. A 2005 study published in The Lancet followed thousands of young adults for 15 years and found that those who ate fast food more than twice weekly gained an extra 10 pounds on average and had double the risk of developing insulin resistance compared to those who ate fast food less than once weekly. Other studies found similar patterns. Dose-response relationships, where more frequent fast food consumption correlated with worse health outcomes. The scientific consensus was clear. Regular fast food consumption contributed to obesity and related diseases. Lawsuits against fast food companies began appearing in the early 2000s, often comparing the industry to tobacco companies that had hidden health risks of their products. In 2002, a lawsuit filed on behalf of obese teenagers argued that McDonald's had misled consumers about the nutritional content and health impacts of its food. The case was dismissed. Judges ruled that consumers bore responsibility for their choices and that the risks of fast food were common knowledge. But the lawsuits generated significant media coverage and put the industry on the defensive. The cheeseburger bills, passed by many state legislatures and considered at the federal level in the mid-2000s, attempted to preemptively protect fast food companies from obesity-related lawsuits. Industry lobbying portrayed lawsuits as frivolous attacks on personal responsibility. Critics argued the bills protected corporations from accountability for deliberately addictive and unhealthy products. The bills generally passed. The industry's political power was substantial, but the debate itself heightened public awareness of fast food health impacts. Media coverage of fast food issues intensified throughout this period. What had been occasional stories about nutrition or food safety became sustained investigative journalism. Major newspapers published series examining fast food industry practices. Television news programs featured segments on childhood obesity and fast food marketing. Magazines ran cover stories on America's weight problem. The hamburger, which had enjoyed largely positive coverage for decades, was now regularly portrayed as a health menace, a symbol of American excess and poor judgment. The industry fought back with its own public relations campaigns. Advertisements emphasized choice, moderation, and personal responsibility. Chains highlighted menu additions like salads, grilled chicken, and fruit, even though these items represented small fractions of sales. McDonald's launched a balanced lifestyles campaign featuring active people enjoying McDonald's food. The message was consistent. Their food wasn't the problem. People's inability to eat it in moderation was the problem. Debates over requiring calorie counts and nutritional information on menus intensified. Public health advocates argued that consumers needed information to make informed choices. The industry resisted, claiming variability in preparation made accurate information impossible, and that posting calories would be expensive and confusing. Behind this resistance was almost certainly concern that explicit calorie information would reduce sales. Studies showed that when calorie information was prominently displayed, consumers ordered lower calorie items and total calories consumed decreased. New York City became the battleground when it moved to require calorie posting in chain restaurants in 2008. The industry sued, arguing the requirement was arbitrary and burdensome. After legal battles, the requirement took effect, and other cities and states followed. Eventually, the Affordable Care Act included provisions requiring calorie posting in chain restaurants nationwide, though implementation took years. The industry's defeat on this issue signaled changing political winds. Public health concerns were beginning to outweigh industry preferences in policy debates. Some chains began genuine adaptations. Subway, which had grown rapidly through the 1990s and 2000s, positioned itself as the healthy fast food alternative, featuring spokesperson Jared Fogle, who'd lost weight eating Subway sandwiches. Chipotle emphasized natural ingredients and responsible sourcing. Panera marketed itself as fast casual rather than fast food, appealing to consumers wanting convenience without fast food's negative associations. These alternatives put pressure on hamburger chains to evolve, but McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's remained enormously successful despite criticism. McDonald's served roughly 70 million customers daily worldwide by the mid-2000s. The company's revenues exceeded $20 billion annually. Burger King and Wendy's also continued growing. The contradiction was stark. Growing public awareness of health risks coincided with continued fast food expansion. Knowledge didn't automatically translate into behavior change, especially when fast food remained convenient and affordable. The scientific consensus on fast food's health impacts was essentially complete by the end of this period. No credible researcher disputed that regular fast food consumption contributed to obesity, cardiovascular disease, and other health problems. The debate had shifted from whether fast food was unhealthy to what should be done about it. Industry advocates argued for personal responsibility and parental supervision of children's diets. Public health advocates pushed for regulation, restrictions on marketing to children, taxes on unhealthy food, zoning limits on fast food restaurants near schools. By the late 2000s, the hamburger's cultural status had become complicated and contradictory. It remained deeply embedded in American life, convenient, affordable, familiar, but it was also increasingly understood as unhealthy, even dangerous when consumed regularly. The hamburger had become a symbol not just of American prosperity, but of American excess, the dark side of convenience culture. The crisis and reckoning of the 1990s and 2000s hadn't destroyed the hamburger industry, but they had permanently changed how Americans understood what they were eating when they unwrapped those paper-wrapped patties. The fast food industry faced a choice in the aftermath of the public health reckoning: resist and defend the status quo, or adapt to changing consumer expectations. The major chains chose adaptation, though often superficial adaptation designed to appear responsive while maintaining their core business model. Meanwhile, a new generation of hamburger restaurants emerged, rejecting fast food's industrialized approach and promising something different: better ingredients, more care, higher quality. The hamburger was fragmenting into multiple market segments, each appealing to different consumer values and price points. McDonald's led the adaptation efforts, introducing premium salads to its menu in 2003. These weren't afterthought salads. They featured spring greens, grilled chicken, and substantial portions, marketed as legitimate meal alternatives. The company promoted them heavily in advertising, featuring salads prominently to signal that McDonald's offered healthy options. The reality was more complicated. Many of the salads, when dressed, contained more calories and fat than hamburgers. And sales remained modest. Most customers didn't visit McDonald's for salads. But the salads served their real purpose, providing cover against criticism that the chain offered nothing healthy. Other menu additions followed similar patterns. Apple slices replaced fries as the default Happy Meal side option in 2011, though customers could still request fries. Oatmeal appeared on breakfast menus. Grilled chicken options proliferated. McDonald's even tested kale briefly. Each edition generated press releases and advertising emphasizing McDonald's commitment to health and choice. The strategy was working in the sense that it blunted some criticism. How could anyone claim McDonald's was unhealthy when they offered salads and fruit? Transparency initiatives represented another adaptation strategy. In 2006, McDonald's began posting nutritional information online and made it available in restaurants. When New York City's calorie posting requirement took effect, McDonald's complied and eventually supported federal requirements, having concluded that universal posting was preferable to a patchwork of local regulations. Displaying calories didn't substantially reduce sales. Most customers ordered what they'd always ordered, but it demonstrated responsiveness to public concerns. Ingredient transparency went further. McDonald's began publishing complete ingredient lists, addressing rumors about additives and fillers. The company started marketing campaigns around ingredient sourcing: beef from North American ranches, egg McMuffins made with real eggs, chicken without antibiotics, announced in 2016, but part of a process beginning earlier. Whether these changes represented genuine improvement or sophisticated marketing was debatable, but they signaled recognition that consumers cared about how their food was produced. The most significant industry evolution came not from the major chains adapting, but from new competitors rejecting the fast food model entirely. Five Guys, founded in 1986 but expanding nationally in the 2000s, represented a different philosophy. The restaurants featured open kitchens where customers watched burgers being prepared. The menu was extremely simple: hamburgers, fries, nothing else. But the execution focused on quality. Fresh ground beef, never frozen. Buns toasted with butter. Hand-cut fries. Free peanuts while waiting. No freezers in the restaurants. and prices roughly double McDonald's. Five Guys succeeded by appealing to customers willing to pay premium prices for perceived quality. The burgers were larger, juicier, customizable with unlimited free toppings. The company avoided advertising, relying on word of mouth and quality reputation. By 2010, Five Guys operated more than 1,000 locations and was expanding internationally. The success demonstrated substantial demand for hamburgers positioned between fast food and full-service restaurants. A better burger that justified higher prices through visible quality differences. Smashburger, founded in 2007, took a different approach to the premium segment. The chain's technique involved smashing balls of ground beef onto a hot griddle, creating maximum crust and flavor. The menu featured regional variations: Colorado burgers with green chilies, Miami burgers with chorizo. The restaurants occupied a fast casual space. No table service but higher quality than traditional fast food, modern decor. Prices around $8 to $10 for a burger. Smashburger grew to hundreds of locations within a few years, proving the market could support multiple premium burger concepts. Shake Shack, which began as a hot dog cart in New York's Madison Square Park in 2001 and opened its first permanent location in 2004, became the most celebrated of the better burger chains. Founder Danny Meyer, already a respected restaurateur, applied fine dining principles to fast casual format. Shake Shack used premium beef blends, made fresh-baked buns, served frozen custard instead of soft-serve ice cream, and designed attractive, modern spaces. The burger cost 3 times what a McDonald's burger cost, but lines stretched around the block. Shake Shack went public in 2015 at a valuation exceeding $1 billion. These better burger chains benefited from and accelerated a broader premium movement in American dining. Grass-fed beef, once a niche product available mainly at farmers' markets, became increasingly available. The argument for grass-fed wasn't just health, though the meat had different fat profiles, but environmental and ethical. Grass-fed cattle weren't raised in feedlots, weren't fed antibiotics routinely, and had lives closer to traditional cattle ranching. Premium burger restaurants embraced grass-fed beef as a differentiator, accepting higher costs in exchange for customer goodwill. Organic beef, raised without synthetic pesticides, hormones, or antibiotics, similarly moved from extreme niche to available option. Whole Foods and other upscale grocers made organic ground beef available. Some restaurants advertised organic beef as a selling point. The organic market remained small as a percentage of total beef consumption. Organic production was expensive and couldn't achieve the scale of conventional production, but its availability signaled changing consumer priorities, at least among affluent consumers willing to pay premium prices. Local sourcing became another competitive strategy. Restaurants advertised partnerships with local farms, emphasizing freshness and supporting regional agriculture. Some chains, like BurgerFi, built their identity around local and natural ingredients. Whether the beef actually came from nearby farms or simply from processors within the region was sometimes unclear. But the marketing message resonated. Local sourcing connected to broader farm-to-table movements that had transformed upscale dining and were now filtering down to fast, casual concepts. Price stratification became increasingly pronounced during this period. McDonald's and other major chains introduced value menus, items priced at $1 or $2, dramatically cheaper than regular menu items. The McDouble, added to the value menu in the mid-2000s, became one of the cheapest sources of protein available anywhere, sometimes cited by economists as a measure of food affordability. Value menus kept fast food accessible to low-income customers, while regular and premium items generated higher margins from customers willing to pay more. At the opposite end, premium burgers at better burger chains could cost $15 or more with fries and a drink. This was restaurant pricing for what was still, fundamentally, a hamburger. The price reflected not just higher ingredient costs, but also the value customers placed on quality perception, ambiance, and the feeling of making a better choice. The hamburger market had stratified dramatically. The same food item ranged from $1 to $15, depending on context, ingredients, and branding. International adaptations showed how hamburger chains negotiated between standardization and local preferences. McDonald's Japan's teriyaki burger, introduced in the 1990s but perfected in the 2000s, featured a ground beef patty with teriyaki sauce, designed for Japanese tastes. In India, where many Hindus don't eat beef, McDonald's introduced the Makaloo Tikki, a potato-based patty spiced with Indian flavors. In the Philippines, McDonald's served spaghetti and fried chicken alongside burgers, recognizing local food preferences. These adaptations represented a shift from McDonald's earlier strategy of exporting identical American menus worldwide. The company learned that some localization increased acceptance without sacrificing operational efficiency. The core products remained standard, but markets got variations reflecting local tastes. This flexibility helped McDonald's maintain growth in international markets, even as American growth slowed. By 2010, more than 60% of McDonald's restaurants were outside the United States. The food truck revolution of the late 2000s and early 2010s created new opportunities for hamburger innovation. Food trucks had existed for decades as utilitarian lunch wagons, but a new generation reimagined them as mobile restaurants serving high-quality, creative food. Gourmet burger trucks appeared in cities across America, featuring unusual combinations. Burgers topped with foie gras, kimchi, peanut butter, elaborate sauces, specialty cheeses. These were burgers as culinary statements, priced accordingly, reaching customers through social media announcements about truck locations. The food truck movement influenced brick-and-mortar restaurants, normalizing creativity and premium ingredients in burger preparation. Chefs who might once have dismissed burgers as lowbrow began taking them seriously. Upscale restaurants added high-end burgers to lunch menus. The burger, which had spent decades as industrialized convenience food, was being reclaimed by actual cooks who cared about technique and ingredients. This development would have been unimaginable in the 1970s, when burgers meant fast food almost exclusively. Celebrity chefs entered the burger space, opening burger-focused restaurants or adding signature burgers to their establishments. Bobby Flay's Bobby's Burger Palace chain, Gordon Ramsay's Burgier restaurants, and numerous independent, chef-driven burger restaurants elevated the form. These weren't necessarily better than good examples of better burger chains. Sometimes the celebrity name exceeded the actual quality, but they signaled cultural status. If serious chefs were making burgers, burgers must be legitimate cuisine. The evolution and adaptation of the 2000s and early 2010s left the hamburger landscape dramatically different from what it had been just a decade earlier. The major chains remained dominant in market share and customer visits, but they'd been forced to adapt, at least superficially, to health concerns and changing expectations. A new tier of better burger chains had established themselves successfully in the fast casual space. Premium and artisanal approaches to burgers had become viable business models. The hamburger market had segmented into multiple distinct niches: value, standard fast food, better burger, premium, artisanal, each serving different customer needs and price points. This fragmentation reflected broader trends in American food culture. Growing inequality meant wider variation in what people could afford, increasing sophistication about food among affluent consumers, and continued demand for convenience and value among working-class families. The hamburger, adaptable as always, had evolved to serve all these markets simultaneously, from dollar menu McDoubles to $15 grass-fed craft burgers. The question moving into the 2010s was whether this diversity represented genuine improvement or simply more sophisticated ways to sell the same basic product. By 2010, the hamburger had become something it had never been before, a subject of serious culinary discourse. Food magazines featured lengthy articles analyzing burger construction techniques. Chefs debated ideal beef blends and proper cooking temperatures. City newspapers published annual best burger rankings that generated fierce arguments among readers. The hamburger, which had spent most of its existence as either working-class sustenance or fast food convenience, had been elevated to an object worthy of connoisseurship. This transformation was both genuine. Some people truly cared deeply about burger quality, and performative, driven by social media's demand for shareable food experiences. Celebrity chefs who'd built reputations on fine dining increasingly turned attention to burgers. David Chang, whose Momofuku restaurants had redefined upscale dining, became obsessed with perfecting burgers, experimenting with beef blends and cooking techniques. April Bloomfield's burger at the Spotted Pig in New York became legendary, with customers waiting hours for tables specifically to order it. Thomas Keller, perhaps America's most celebrated chef, added a burger to the menu at his Napa Valley bistro, treating it with the same meticulous attention he gave 3 Michelin-star cuisine. When chefs of this caliber focused on burgers, they legitimized them as worthy of serious craft. The celebrity chef burger often featured specific technical choices that distinguished it from both fast food and typical restaurant burgers. Custom beef blends, combinations of chuck, short rib, and brisket, for instance, became common, with chefs arguing that different cuts contributed different qualities. Dry aging beef, a technique typically reserved for steaks, was applied to burger meat, producing deeper flavors. Cooking methods received scrutiny. Some chefs insisted on cast iron skillets, others on specific griddle temperatures, others on grilling over hardwood. This technical precision elevated burger making from simple cooking to craft. Instagram, launched in 2010, transformed food culture by making visual appeal paramount. A dish wasn't just something to eat, it was content to share. Burgers proved ideal Instagram subjects. They were visually striking, stackable into impressive towers, photographable from satisfying angles. The Instagrammable burger became a recognized category, featuring excessive height, colorful ingredients, dramatic presentation. Restaurants designed burgers, partly for taste, but also for social media impact. Understanding that customers photographing and sharing their food provided free advertising. This visual food culture drove increasingly extreme burger creations. the everything burger emerged. Multiple patties, multiple cheeses, bacon, avocado, fried eggs, onion rings, special sauces, all stacked into structures that were nearly impossible to eat without disassembly. Some restaurants introduced burgers so large they required challenges, finish within a time limit, and win a prize. These spectacle burgers were partly genuine offerings and partly marketing stunts, designed to go viral on social media. They represented the opposite of fast food's efficiency: excessive, indulgent, meant to be experienced and shared more than simply consumed. The craft burger boom concentrated in urban areas where affluent consumers clustered. Cities like Portland, Austin, Denver, and Brooklyn became known for burger cultures with dozens of high-quality options. These weren't chains, but independent restaurants, often chef-owned, treating burgers as vehicles for creativity and quality. Prices reflected this positioning. $12 to $15 for a burger became standard in these establishments, sometimes reaching $20 or more. The customers willing to pay these prices were often young professionals, the demographic most engaged with foodie culture and social media. Regional burger styles, which had always existed but rarely received recognition, became celebrated during this period. The smash burger, which places like Smashburger had popularized nationally, was recognized as having Oklahoma origins. In the 1930s, during the Depression, Oklahoma cooks had developed the technique of pressing balls of beef flat on hot griddles, creating maximum crust. The Oklahoma onion burger, which pressed thin sliced onions directly into the patty before cooking, was rediscovered and acclaimed. Food writers traveled to El Reno, Oklahoma, to document the style, and articles appeared in national publications celebrating this regional tradition. California-style burgers, characterized by fresh vegetables, avocado, and relatively light preparation, were distinguished from East Coast styles that tended toward richer toppings and heartier construction. The green chili cheeseburger of New Mexico gained national recognition. The Juicy Lucy of Minneapolis, cheese stuffed inside the patty rather than on top, became a pilgrimage destination for burger enthusiasts. This regional recognition represented a shift from standardization toward appreciation of diversity and local tradition, even as national chains continued homogenizing most Americans' burger experiences. Bacon became nearly ubiquitous on burgers during this period, appearing on menus that might once have offered bacon as an optional add-on, but now featured it as standard on multiple burger varieties. The bacon trend extended beyond burgers. Bacon appeared on everything from donuts to ice cream, but burgers were central to it. The combination of beef and pork fat, the textural contrast of crispy bacon against soft bun and juicy patty, and bacon's cultural association with indulgence all contributed to its dominance. By 2015, most burger restaurants offered more bacon options than non-bacon options. Exotic toppings proliferated as restaurants competed for attention. Peanut butter burgers, which had existed as regional oddities, became trendy. Fried eggs on burgers moved from breakfast specialty to standard option. Kimchi, sriracha mayo, truffle aioli, foie gras, lobster, bone marrow. Ingredients that would have seemed absurd on burgers a decade earlier appeared on upscale burger menus. Some combinations were genuinely good, others were publicity stunts, but all reflected how burgers had become spaces for culinary experimentation rather than simply standardized products. Food delivery apps, Grubhub, Uber Eats, DoorDash, and others, transformed burger consumption patterns beginning around 2013. Previously, eating burgers meant either visiting restaurants or picking up takeout. Delivery apps made restaurant-quality burgers available at home with minimal effort. This convenience proved enormously popular, particularly among young urban professionals. Delivery introduced new considerations for burger design. Would it survive a 20-minute drive? How could packaging maintain temperature and prevent sogginess? Some restaurants redesigned burgers specifically for delivery. The delivery app phenomenon benefited both fast food chains and independent restaurants, but it particularly helped chains maintain relevance with younger consumers who might otherwise have abandoned them for better burger options. McDonald's and other major chains integrated with delivery platforms, making fast food even more convenient. The apps also generated data about consumer preferences, ordering patterns, and price sensitivity that chains used to optimize menus and marketing. While American burger culture fragmented into artisanal and industrial segments, fast food chains experienced explosive growth in developing nations. China, which had barely known hamburgers before the 1990s, became McDonald's second largest market after the United States. By 2015, McDonald's operated more than 2,000 locations in China and was opening roughly one new restaurant daily. KFC actually outperformed McDonald's in China. Fried chicken translated more easily to Chinese tastes, but burgers were establishing themselves as modern, Western, aspirational food for China's growing middle class. India presented different challenges and opportunities. McDonald's adapted extensively for Indian markets, eliminating beef entirely and offering chicken, fish, and vegetarian burgers. The Makaloo Tikki, a potato patty with Indian spices, became one of McDonald's most successful products globally. In predominantly Muslim regions, restaurants were certified halal. The adaptations worked. McDonald's India grew to hundreds of locations, and other chains followed. The hamburger in India wasn't really a hamburger in the traditional sense, but it occupied the same cultural and commercial space. The growth in China and India meant that by 2015, millions of people were eating hamburgers or hamburger-like sandwiches, for whom the food had no cultural history or traditional associations. For them, the hamburger was simply modern fast food, associated with globalization, Western culture, and middle-class consumption. This represented the final step in the hamburger's transformation from German ethnic food to American national cuisine to global commodity. The hamburger had become deterritorialized, no longer attached to any particular place or culture. The tension between artisanal and industrial burger models was increasingly apparent by the mid-2010s. Artisanal burger advocates argued for better ingredients, ethical sourcing, living wages for workers, environmental responsibility, and food as craft rather than commodity. Industrial fast food offered convenience, affordability, consistency, and efficiency. These weren't complementary values. They were fundamentally different philosophies about food's role in society. The same person might eat artisanal burgers as special occasions and fast food burgers as convenient weekday lunch, but the contradiction was real. Price remained the starkest dividing line. A McDonald's McDouble cost $1.29 in 2015. A craft burger at an independent restaurant might cost $14 without fries or drink. For many Americans, the craft burger simply wasn't an option. Not because they didn't appreciate quality, but because $14 for lunch was impossible. The celebration of artisanal burgers in food media and on social media came from a relatively privileged position, accessible to people with disposable income and leisure time to seek out and wait for high-quality food. Yet the artisanal movement's influence extended beyond those who could regularly afford it. Standards rose across the industry. Even mid-tier chains improved quality in response to competition. The better burger segment, occupying space between fast food and high-end artisanal, grew steadily, offering quality improvements at more accessible prices. An awareness of industrial foods problems, health, environmental, labor, had spread widely enough that even people who continued eating fast food often did so with ambivalence, recognizing the contradictions in their choices. The hamburger in 2015 was simultaneously multiple things: dollar menu fast food, craft culinary creation, Instagram content, global commodity, regional tradition, health menace, comfort food, and cultural symbol. It had fragmented into so many varieties and contexts that generalizing about the hamburger was increasingly difficult. What unified these diverse forms was the basic structure: ground beef patty on a bun, and the cultural recognition that this combination, however prepared or served, was a hamburger. The next phase would see further evolution as technological innovation, changing consumer values, and environmental pressures forced yet another reinvention of this endlessly adaptable food. In 2016, a small Silicon Valley startup called Impossible Foods began serving its plant-based burger at a single upscale restaurant in New York. The Impossible Burger, made from soy and potato proteins and engineered to mimic beef's taste and texture, represented years of biochemical research. The key innovation was heme, an iron-containing molecule found in blood that gives meat its distinctive flavor, which Impossible produced from genetically modified yeast. The result was a plant-based patty that browned, sizzled, and even bled like beef. Early reviews ranged from skeptical to astonished. Some tasters claimed they couldn't distinguish it from beef. Others found it close, but not quite there. What mattered was that it was close enough. Beyond Meat, founded in 2009, but achieving mainstream distribution around 2016, took a different approach. Instead of heme, Beyond used beet juice for color and a combination of pea protein, rice protein, and mung bean protein to create meat-like texture. The Beyond Burger appeared in grocery stores, allowing home cooks to purchase plant-based burgers alongside conventional ground beef. This distribution strategy proved crucial, being available in supermarket meat cases rather than only in vegetarian sections, signaled that plant-based burgers weren't niche products, but mainstream alternatives. The emergence of convincing plant-based burgers represented more than culinary innovation. It reflected growing concern about industrial meat production's environmental impact. Cattle ranching contributed substantially to greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, and water consumption. A 2018 study estimated that producing a pound of beef generated approximately 6 times more greenhouse gases than producing a pound of plant-based protein. For environmentally conscious consumers, particularly younger ones, eating less meat was becoming an ethical imperative. Plant-based burgers offered a way to reduce environmental impact without sacrificing the burger experience. Animal welfare concerns reinforced environmental motivations. As consumers learned more about factory farming conditions, overcrowded feedlots, antibiotic use, slaughter practices. Some became uncomfortable with their complicity in the system. Plant-based alternatives eliminated these ethical concerns entirely. The marketing often emphasized this angle. Enjoy your burger without harm to animals. For some consumers, this message resonated powerfully. For others, it was irrelevant. They were concerned with taste and convenience, not animal welfare. Traditional burger chains initially dismissed plant-based alternatives as fads, but as sales grew, they recognized a market opportunity. Burger King introduced the Impossible Whopper in 2019, heavily promoting it as tasting identical to the regular Whopper. The campaign was successful. Many locations struggled to meet demand initially. McDonald's tested the McPlant, developed with Beyond Meat, in select markets beginning in 2021. White Castle, Carl's Jr., and other chains added plant-based options. By 2022, having a plant-based burger on the menu was standard for major chains, though sales remained a small percentage of total burger sales. The addition of plant-based options created operational complications. Chains had to decide whether to cook plant-based patties on the same grills as meat, efficient but potentially alienating vegetarians and vegans, or use separate equipment, adding complexity and cost. Most chains opted for shared cooking surfaces, with disclaimers that plant-based items might contact meat. This satisfied most flexitarians, people reducing but not eliminating meat, while disappointing strict vegetarians. The decision revealed that chains viewed plant-based burgers primarily as alternatives for meat eaters, not as products for committed vegetarians. Lab-grown or cultivated meat emerged as a potential future alternative. Companies like Memphis Meats, Mosa Meat, and Upside Foods developed techniques to grow real animal muscle tissue from cell cultures without raising or slaughtering animals. In 2020, Singapore became the first country to approve cultured meat for sale. Lab-grown chicken nuggets appeared in a Singapore restaurant, and burgers were expected to follow. Proponents argued cultivated meat offered environmental benefits similar to plant-based alternatives while being actual meat, potentially appealing to consumers unwilling to accept plant-based substitutes. However, cultivated meat faced substantial obstacles. Production costs remained prohibitively high, though declining rapidly, and scaling to mass production presented technical challenges. Consumer acceptance was uncertain. Surveys showed many people found the concept disturbing or unnatural. Regulatory approval varied by country, with some governments cautious about approving novel food production methods. By 2024, cultivated meat remained more promise than reality, available in only a few restaurants, globally at premium prices. Whether it would ever achieve the scale and affordability to compete with conventional or plant-based burgers remained uncertain. The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2020, dramatically accelerated changes already underway in how Americans accessed burgers. Lockdowns closed restaurant dining rooms, leaving only takeout and delivery. Delivery apps, which had been growing but still represented a minority of restaurant orders, became essential. For months, delivery was often the only way to get restaurant food. This forced adoption by consumers who'd previously avoided delivery apps created lasting habit changes. Even after dining rooms reopened, delivery remained far more popular than pre-pandemic, fundamentally altering restaurant economics. Ghost kitchens, commercial kitchen facilities designed purely for delivery, with no dining room or customer-facing presence, proliferated during the pandemic. These operations could produce burgers at lower cost than traditional restaurants by eliminating expensive real estate in high-traffic areas and front-of-house staff. Some ghost kitchens operated multiple restaurant brands from a single location, each with distinct menus and branding, but sharing equipment and staff. Mr. Beast Burger, a virtual restaurant brand launched by YouTuber Mr. Beast in 2020, operated entirely through ghost kitchens and existing restaurants preparing Mr. Beast menu items, demonstrating new possibilities for burger businesses. Automated cooking technology, which had been tested intermittently for years, gained attention during pandemic-era labor shortages. Creator, a San Francisco restaurant, used a robot to grind beef, form patties, grill them, and assemble burgers with minimal human intervention. Other companies developed burger flipping robots, automated fry stations, and AI-powered order systems. Whether automation represented the future of burger preparation or expensive novelty remained debated. Labor costs and difficulty hiring workers pushed chains toward automation, but implementation challenges and customer resistance to fully automated restaurants slowed adoption. Global burger culture continued diversifying with regional and fusion variations. The ramen burger, which replaced buns with compressed ramen noodles, originated in New York in 2013, but spread globally through the 2010s. The sushi burger, which replaced buns with compressed sushi rice and featured raw fish instead of beef, appeared in Japan and spread to other Asian markets. In South Korea, burgers topped with kimchi and gochujang became standard. Thailand developed burgers incorporating local spices and flavors. These weren't novelties, but genuine regional burger traditions, demonstrating the form's adaptability to local culinary contexts. Expansion in Asia and Africa continued rapidly through this period. McDonald's announced plans for thousands of new Chinese locations by 2025. India's middle class, growing rapidly, supported expansion of McDonald's, Burger King, and local chains. In Africa, where McDonald's had limited presence, South African chains like Steers and international chains adapted to local markets. Nigeria, Kenya, and other African nations saw burger chains opening in major cities, targeting emerging middle-class consumers. The hamburger's global spread, which had begun in the 1970s, was reaching completion. Few parts of the world remained without burger access. Generational shifts in consumption patterns became increasingly apparent. Gen Z consumers, reaching adulthood in the late 2010s and early 2020s, showed different preferences than previous generations. They valued sustainability, transparency, and ethical sourcing more highly. They were more likely to try plant-based alternatives, more skeptical of traditional advertising, and more influenced by social media. For many Gen Z consumers, McDonald's wasn't iconic childhood comfort food. It was an environmental and health problem their generation needed to solve. This presented challenges for chains whose business models depended on childhood brand loyalty, translating into lifetime consumption. Yet economic accessibility remained crucial to the hamburger's appeal across all generations. During inflationary periods in 2021, 2023, when grocery and restaurant prices rose sharply, fast food, burgers remained among the most affordable prepared foods available. A McDonald's McDouble still cost around $2 in most markets, less than many grocery items that required additional preparation. For working-class families, students, and others with limited budgets, Fast food wasn't an indulgence or occasional treat. It was sometimes the most economical option. Criticism of fast food often came from positions of relative privilege, overlooking that millions of people relied on it for affordable nutrition. The tension between premium and value segments intensified during this period. Craft burger restaurants, which had proliferated in the 2010s, faced difficulties as rising labor and ingredient costs pushed prices higher. A burger, fries, and drink at a craft burger restaurant might cost $25 by 2023, pricing out many potential customers. Meanwhile, fast food chains protected value menu pricing as essential to their business model, even as they added premium options at higher prices. The bifurcation of the burger market, cheap fast food versus expensive craft burgers with shrinking middle ground, reflected broader economic inequality. Health concerns, which had driven substantial criticism in previous decades, became somewhat less prominent in public discourse by the early 2020s, perhaps because they'd been so thoroughly aired already. Everyone knew fast food was unhealthy. This was accepted common knowledge. The question was what to do about it. Some jurisdictions implemented soda taxes or restricted fast food marketing to children. Some chains voluntarily reduced sodium or changed cooking oils. But fundamentally, the health impacts of regular burger consumption were unchanged, still contributing to obesity, still linked to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. The difference was resignation. Society had largely accepted these consequences as the price of convenience and affordability. By 2024, the hamburger existed in its most diverse form ever. Plant-based versions competed alongside conventional beef. Chains offered everything from $1 value items to $10 premium burgers. Delivery apps made burgers available anywhere, anytime. Regional variations proliferated globally, while standardized fast food maintained its dominance through volume. The hamburger had become everything to everyone. Sustainable plant-based future to some, affordable sustenance to others, craft culinary project to food enthusiasts, guilty pleasure to health-conscious consumers, global commodity to investors, and environmental disaster to climate activists. What remained constant was the basic appeal, a flavorful, handheld, satisfying meal, accessible to almost anyone. The hamburger had survived and thrived through a century of criticism, adaptation, and evolution, precisely because it was fundamentally simple and flexible. Whatever changes lay ahead, cultured meat, further automation, new regulations, shifting consumer preferences, the hamburger would likely adapt again, as it had so many times before. The specific form might change, but the concept seemed likely to endure, a permanent feature of global food culture, for better and for worse. Looking across 2,000 years of ground meat preparation and more than a century of the hamburger as we know it, certain patterns emerge with clarity. The hamburger's journey from Central Asian necessity through German immigrant food to global phenomenon wasn't accidental or inevitable. It resulted from specific conditions, innovations, and choices that offer insights extending far beyond food history. Understanding these patterns helps explain not just how the hamburger conquered the world, but how any cultural practice can transform from marginal to ubiquitous, and what consequences follow from that transformation. The progression from immigrant dish to working-class food to mass commodity to cultural icon represents a common pattern in American food history, but the hamburger executed it with unusual completeness. German immigrants brought Hamburg-style beef to America as familiar ethnic food, something that connected them to home and community. It remained ethnic food, associated with German beer gardens and neighborhoods for decades. The transformation to working-class food happened when the sandwich format made it accessible beyond German communities, serving industrial workers who needed cheap, portable meals. Mass commodity status arrived with White Castle's standardization in the 1920s, when the hamburger became a reproducible product rather than an individual preparation. Cultural icon status emerged gradually through the mid-20th century as the hamburger shed its working-class associations and became democratically American. Food for everyone, carrying no class stigma. This progression required the hamburger to repeatedly shed its previous identity. Each transformation left some people behind. German Americans who saw their ethnic food become generic, working-class communities whose familiar food became mainstream and lost its authentic context. Nostalgic critics who mourn the replacement of regional food traditions with standardized chains. But each transformation also expanded access, making the hamburger available to more people in more contexts. The pattern suggests that widespread adoption requires a food to transcend its origins, becoming abstract enough to mean different things to different groups, while maintaining enough consistency to remain recognizable. Standardization's role in the hamburger's global spread cannot be overstated. White Castle's insight in the 1920s that uniform quality mattered more than exceptional quality proved revolutionary. Ray Kroc perfected this principle at McDonald's, creating systems so detailed that any location anywhere could produce virtually identical products. This standardization had multiple effects. It built consumer trust. Customers knew what they would receive before ordering. It enabled rapid expansion. New locations could open without finding skilled cooks. It created efficiency. Optimized processes meant lower costs and higher volume. And it made the hamburger essentially a manufactured product rather than prepared food, reproducible, predictable, scalable. The power of standardization extended beyond operations to branding and culture. McDonald's golden arches became more recognizable globally than most national flags. The Big Mac served as an informal currency in international economics. The Big Mac Index compared purchasing power across countries. This cultural standardization had both democratizing and homogenizing effects. On one hand, it meant a traveler could find familiar food anywhere, that a poor family in Mississippi and a wealthy family in Connecticut could eat the same meal, that national and cultural boundaries became less relevant to food access. On the other hand, it meant local food traditions faced competition from standardized alternatives, that culinary diversity decreased, that eating became less connected to place and season. The unintended consequences of industrial food success reveal a pattern relevant to many technological and commercial innovations. Solutions to immediate problems create delayed problems that are often larger than those they solved. The hamburger solved problems of expensive protein, time-consuming meal preparation, and limited food options for mobile workers. But success at solving these problems created the conditions for obesity epidemics, environmental degradation from industrial beef production, antibiotic resistance from factory farming, and economic structures that paid workers too little to afford anything but cheap fast food. These consequences weren't inevitable in the hamburger itself. They resulted from the specific industrial model that enabled mass hamburger production. This pattern appears repeatedly in industrial history. Solutions are optimized for immediate metrics: cost, speed, convenience, while externalities are ignored until they become crises. The hamburger industry optimized for cheap, fast production while externalizing costs to public health systems treating obesity and diabetes, environmental systems damaged by cattle production, and workers whose low wages required public assistance. These externalized costs were real. They simply weren't reflected in the price of a $1 hamburger. Recognizing this pattern suggests that true cost accounting, including health, environmental, and social costs, produces different conclusions about what represents success. Innovation cycles in hamburger history reveal how necessity drives initial innovation, which is then refined into craft, which becomes industrialized, which eventually faces rejection by those seeking to return to craft. The nomadic warriors who first ground meat did so from necessity, making tough meat edible with available tools. German butchers refined this into skilled craft: proper seasoning, optimal grinding, particular cooking methods. White Castle and McDonald's industrialized it: systematized, standardized, de-skilled. The craft burger movement of the 2000s and 2010s rejected industrialization, returning to artisanal approaches, premium ingredients, and skilled preparation. But craft burgers cost 3 to 10 times what industrial burgers cost, making them accessible primarily to affluent consumers, which recreates class divisions that industrialization had supposedly eliminated. This cycle suggests tension between accessibility and quality that may be inherent rather than solvable. Craft production produces better products but serves fewer people at higher prices. Industrial production serves more people at lower prices but with lower quality and various externalized costs. The solution of creating both premium and value tiers simply segments the market, with different populations receiving different quality levels based on income. Whether this represents acceptable compromise or systemic injustice depends on one's values and political framework. Cultural adaptation of the hamburger, as it spread globally, demonstrates remarkable flexibility in the basic format. The same structure, ground protein patty on bread, accommodated Japanese teriyaki sauce, Indian spices, Middle Eastern lamb, and countless other variations. This adaptability was crucial to global acceptance. Pure standardization would have limited adoption, but the adaptations were carefully bounded. Enough localization to feel culturally appropriate, not so much that the product became unrecognizable or operationally complex. This balance between standardization and adaptation represents sophisticated cultural negotiation, though whether it represents cultural exchange or cultural imperialism with local flavor remains debated. The economic lessons from hamburger chains' success are now taught in business schools worldwide. The franchising model allowed rapid expansion using others' capital while maintaining control through detailed operational requirements. Real estate holdings provided stable income streams independent of food sales. Volume-based models accepted tiny per-unit profits in exchange for enormous scale. Vertical integration gave chains control over supply chains, reducing costs and improving quality control. Marketing focused on children built lifetime loyalty. These strategies proved so successful they've been applied across industries far beyond food service. But these economic innovations also created power imbalances. Franchisees bore most financial risk, while corporate controlled operations and extracted rents. Workers had no leverage in labor markets, flooded with desperate applicants. Suppliers competed primarily on price, driving their own workers' wages down. Small businesses couldn't compete with chains' economies of scale and marketing budgets. The economic efficiency that made hamburgers cheap created an ecosystem where efficiency benefited capital holders while costs fell on workers, franchisees, and small competitors. Whether this represents creative destruction that benefits consumers through lower prices or exploitation that concentrates wealth while creating poverty-wage jobs, has no objective answer. It's a political question disguised as an economic one. The recurring tension between health and convenience reflects broader challenges in modern life. Humans evolved for environments where calories were scarce and movement was unavoidable. We now inhabit environments where calories are abundant and movement is optional. The hamburger represents the logical extreme of this transformation. Maximum calories with minimum effort. Our conscious minds know this is unhealthy, but our evolutionary programming finds it irresistible. This tension between knowledge and behavior, between what we know we should do and what we actually do, appears throughout modern life but is particularly acute around food. Resolving this tension requires either changing environments, making unhealthy food less available and healthy food more convenient, or changing behavior through extraordinary willpower applied constantly. Societies have tried both approaches with limited success. Regulation faces political opposition from industries and consumers who resist being told what to eat. Individual willpower fails repeatedly because it requires fighting evolutionary programming with finite mental resources. The hamburger's continued dominance, despite widespread knowledge of health consequences, suggests this tension may be fundamentally unresolvable in environments of abundance without substantial structural changes. What worked in the hamburger's success was the alignment of simplicity, affordability, and adaptability. The basic concept is simple enough that anyone can grasp it and prepare it with minimal training. Affordability meant it was accessible across income levels, creating mass markets. Adaptability allowed it to fit different cultural contexts, meal occasions, and consumer preferences. These three characteristics, reinforcing each other, created unstoppable momentum. Foods lacking any of these characteristics might succeed in niches but couldn't achieve the hamburger's global dominance. What failed, or what created serious problems, was ignoring health impacts, environmental costs, and labor conditions in pursuit of efficiency and profit. These failures weren't accidental. They were structural. Companies that prioritized health, environment, or labor welfare over cost efficiency couldn't compete with companies that externalized those costs. Market competition drove toward the lowest cost provider, and the lowest cost providers were those willing to create the most externalities. Addressing these failures requires intervention beyond individual companies or consumer choice. It requires collective action through regulation, taxation, or other mechanisms that change the competitive landscape. The hamburger's root appeal lies in characteristics that may be fundamental to human psychology and modern life. Portability answers mobility needs in societies where people move constantly. Customization provides control and individual expression in standardized environments. Familiarity offers comfort in a rapidly changing world. The hamburger succeeds because it addresses genuine human needs and desires. Criticizing it without understanding this appeal explains why decades of health warnings have barely dented consumption. People don't eat hamburgers despite knowing better. They eat them because hamburgers solve real problems in their lives, even while creating other problems they'll deal with later or not at all. Understanding the hamburger's history reveals it as neither villain nor hero, but as a mirror reflecting industrial capitalism's successes and failures, American culture's values and contradictions, and modernity's conveniences and costs. The lessons it offers extend far beyond food, illuminating patterns in how innovations spread, how industries develop, how convenience conflicts with health, and how economic efficiency can coexist with social harm. What we choose to do with these lessons, whether we modify our food systems or continue on current trajectories, will shape not just what we eat, but what kind of society we become. The journey we've traced, from Central Asian horsemen pressing meat beneath saddles to drive-through windows serving billions of burgers annually, spans roughly 1,000 years of continuous adaptation. What began as a practical solution to nomadic life's constraints became a German port city's signature preparation, then an immigrant food in American cities, then industrialized fast food, and finally, a global phenomenon touching nearly every corner of human civilization. The hamburger's story is one of remarkable transformation, but perhaps more remarkable is the continuity beneath that transformation. The recognition that ground meat shaped into patties and cooked remains fundamentally satisfying to humans across vast differences in culture, wealth, and circumstance. The core transformation is almost incomprehensible in its scale. Practical nomadic food, created from necessity by people who lived entire lives on horseback, became the world's most eaten sandwich, served an estimated 50 billion times annually by the 2020s. No food in human history has achieved this level of global ubiquity in such a compressed timeframe. McDonald's alone serves roughly 70 million customers daily across more than 100 countries. Add Burger King, Wendy's, and countless other chains and independent restaurants, and the hamburger has become perhaps the most common prepared food on earth, transcending the geographic and cultural boundaries that contain most cuisines. Yet this success has created challenges that threaten the hamburger's future in its current form. Sustainability concerns are mounting as evidence accumulates about beef production's environmental impact. Cattle ranching remains a primary driver of deforestation in South America. Methane emissions from cattle digestion contribute measurably to climate change. Water usage for feed crops strains resources in drought-prone regions. As climate change accelerates and environmental consciousness grows, particularly among younger generations, the industrial beef production model that makes cheap hamburgers possible faces increasing scrutiny and resistance. Health challenges remain equally pressing. Obesity rates continue climbing globally, particularly in countries adopting Western dietary patterns. Type 2 diabetes has become epidemic. Cardiovascular disease linked to diet remains a leading cause of death worldwide. The hamburger isn't solely responsible. Many factors contribute to these outcomes, but regular fast food consumption is clearly implicated. Public health systems bear costs that hamburger prices don't reflect. The individual paying $2 for a burger doesn't pay the collective medical costs treating obesity-related conditions, creating a disconnect between private benefit and public cost. Labor practices in the fast food industry continue generating concern and conflict. Workers in most countries remain low-paid, with minimal benefits and unpredictable schedules. The industry's business model depends on high turnover and easily replaceable workers, which means individual employees have little leverage to demand improvements. Periodic efforts to raise minimum wages or mandate benefits face fierce industry resistance. Whether this represents efficient labor market functioning or exploitation of vulnerable workers depends on one's perspective. But the discontent among workers suggests the current model may not be sustainable long-term. Multiple potential futures are emerging rather than a single, clear trajectory. The plant-based future, championed by companies like Impossible and Beyond Meat, envisions hamburgers with dramatically lower environmental impact and no animal welfare concerns. Sales of plant-based burgers have grown substantially, and major chains now offer them as standard options. Whether this represents a fundamental shift or a niche market serving committed vegetarians and environmentally conscious consumers remains uncertain. Current evidence suggests the latter. Plant-based burgers occupy perhaps 5% of the burger market, growing but nowhere near displacing conventional beef. The lab-grown or cultivated meat future promises actual beef without raising cattle, potentially offering environmental benefits while preserving the experience of eating real meat. Several companies have achieved regulatory approval in select markets, and cultivated chicken and beef are now available in a handful of restaurants worldwide. But production costs remain high, scaling challenges are substantial, and consumer acceptance is uncertain. Surveys suggest significant portions of the population find the concept disturbing or unnatural. Lab-grown meat may eventually become viable, but it likely remains years or decades from price parity with conventional beef. The artisanal future, represented by craft burger restaurants and better burger chains, emphasizes quality ingredients, ethical sourcing, and skilled preparation. This segment has grown steadily and established itself as a sustainable middle ground between industrial fast food and fine dining. But artisanal burgers serve primarily affluent urban consumers willing to pay premium prices. They represent a return to earlier patterns where quality food was accessible mainly to those with resources, which conflicts with the hamburger's democratic appeal as food for everyone, regardless of income. The industrial fast food model, despite criticism and competition, shows no signs of disappearing. McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's continue opening thousands of new locations annually, particularly in Asia and Africa. The model's economics remain compelling. High volume and low margins generate enormous profits. For billions of people, fast food burgers represent affordable, convenient nutrition. Dismissing this model as obsolete ignores the genuine needs it serves and the lack of alternatives providing similar affordability and convenience. These futures will likely coexist rather than one replacing others. Just as the hamburger market today includes everything from dollar menu value items to $20 craft burgers, future markets will probably include plant-based, lab-grown, premium conventional beef, and industrial fast food options. This diversity reflects broader economic stratification, different populations with different incomes accessing different quality tiers. Whether this represents healthy market variety or troubling inequality depends on one's political and ethical framework. Evidence suggests the hamburger will continue evolving rather than disappearing, as it has throughout its history. Each challenge has prompted adaptation rather than abandonment. Health concerns led to menu diversification and transparency initiatives. Environmental concerns are driving plant-based alternatives and more sustainable sourcing. Labor issues may eventually force wage increases and better conditions, raising prices but improving workers' lives. The hamburger's fundamental adaptability, its capacity to accommodate different proteins, preparations, and cultural contexts while remaining recognizable, suggests it will continue finding forms that work in changing circumstances. Individual choices exist within cultural forces that shape what feels like choice. A person deciding whether to eat a hamburger makes that decision within a context created by decades of marketing, infrastructure development, economic constraints, and cultural conditioning. The convenient location of fast food restaurants, the affordability of their products, the familiarity built through childhood exposure, these aren't natural facts, but results of specific business decisions and public policies. Recognizing this context doesn't eliminate individual responsibility, but it complicates simple narratives about personal choice. People often make the best decisions they can within environments they didn't create and can't individually change. Communities are beginning to rethink relationships with fast food in ways that acknowledge both its utility and its costs. Some cities have restricted new fast food restaurants near schools, recognizing that environmental factors shape children's eating habits. Some communities have organized to demand better wages and conditions for fast food workers. Some institutions have committed to sourcing more sustainable beef or offering plant-based alternatives. These local actions can't themselves transform the global hamburger industry, but they demonstrate recognition that current arrangements are changeable rather than inevitable. The measured conclusion we must reach is that the hamburger's adaptability suggests survival, but guarantees continued transformation. The hamburger of 2050 may be plant-based, lab-grown, made from insects, or something not yet imagined. It may cost much more as environmental and health costs are internalized. It may be prepared by robots rather than humans. But if history provides guidance, something recognizable as a hamburger will remain. Ground protein formed into patties, placed on bread, held in hand, satisfying hunger and providing comfort through familiarity. Returning to human scale after this expansive history, what does the hamburger mean today to an individual person? For many, it remains what it's been for decades: convenient, affordable food requiring no thought or preparation. For others, it's guilty pleasure, something eaten despite knowledge of health and environmental impacts. For some, it's nostalgic comfort, connecting to childhood memories and family experiences. For others still, it's symbol of everything wrong with modern food systems: industrial, unhealthy, unsustainable. These meanings coexist in contradiction, reflecting the hamburger's genuine complexity. It is simultaneously all these things, and which meaning dominates depends on individual circumstances and values. The quiet acknowledgement we must make is that this simple sandwich, meat and bread, the most basic combination imaginable, has reshaped how the world eats more profoundly than perhaps any food in human history. It demonstrated that food could be fully industrialized while remaining appealing, It proved that standardization could coexist with satisfaction. It showed that global food culture could emerge, transcending local traditions while somehow accommodating them. The hamburger's success validated an approach to food as manufactured product rather than cultural practice, as commodity rather than craft, as fuel rather than experience. Whether this transformation represents progress or loss cannot be answered objectively. It depends on what one values. The hamburger made protein accessible to billions who might otherwise struggle to afford it. It saved countless hours of domestic labor, particularly women's labor, freeing time for other pursuits. It created millions of jobs and generated enormous economic activity. These are genuine accomplishments, not to be dismissed lightly, but it also contributed to obesity epidemics, environmental degradation, and the erosion of food traditions that had sustained communities for generations. These costs are equally real. As we stand in the present, looking toward a future that will necessarily be different from the past, the hamburger remains what it has always been: adaptable, accessible, and somehow essential to modern life, despite all valid criticisms. It will change because it must. Environmental pressures, health concerns, and changing values will force evolution. But it will persist because it serves genuine human needs for quick, affordable, satisfying food in a world where time and money are scarce resources for most people. The story of the hamburger, from ancient steps to global phenomenon, is ultimately the story of modernity itself. Its conveniences and costs, its innovations and consequences, its capacity to solve problems while creating new ones. We made the hamburger, and the hamburger made us, shaped our landscapes, our economies, our bodies, our cultures. Understanding this history doesn't provide simple answers about what comes next, but it offers context for the choices ahead. The hamburger we create for the future will reflect the values we choose to prioritize: efficiency or sustainability, convenience or health, profit or equity. In that sense, the hamburger's next chapter hasn't been written yet. It waits for us to decide what kind of world and what kind of food we want.